Somewhere beneath the North Atlantic, in water so cold and black that light itself gave up trying to reach it, a man sat perfectly still and waited. He was not afraid. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about him. While the ocean pressed against the hull of his submarine with a force that could crush a man's ribcage like a paper box, while grown men whispered prayers in the dark, and junior officers stared at gauges they had already memorized, this man sat still. He listened, he calculated, he waited. His name was Otto Kretschmer, and at that particular moment, in the early months of 1941, he was the most dangerous submariner alive. Not because he was reckless, not because he was cruel, but because he was patient, in a way that bordered on inhuman, and precise, in a way that made luck almost irrelevant. The Atlantic Ocean is not a battlefield in any conventional sense. There are no fixed lines, no trenches, no landmarks. There is only grey water stretching to grey sky, a convoy of merchant ships loaded with food and fuel, and weapons, trying desperately to cross from one continent to another, and somewhere out there, beneath the surface, something hunting them. In the years between 1940 and 1941, that something wore the designation U-99, and the man at its controls was already becoming a legend in 2 languages simultaneously, celebrated in German newspapers and feared in British Admiralty briefings. He would sink more Allied merchant tonnage than any other submarine commander of the Second World War. More than 200,000 tons of shipping, dozens of vessels, thousands of lives disrupted, altered, ended. The numbers are staggering even now, decades later, when we look at them with the calm distance that history allows. In the moment, in the ice-grey North Atlantic, those numbers represented a strategic catastrophe for Britain, a nation that literally could not survive without the supplies those ships were carrying. And yet the story of Otto Kretschmer does not end in triumph. It does not end with a hero returning home to flowers and speeches and a grateful nation. It ends somewhere quite different. It ends on a freezing morning on the 17th of March, 1942, with a damaged submarine rising slowly to a surface it had no business returning to, and a commander stepping onto a conning tower to face the ships that had beaten him. That morning is what this documentary is about. Not just the capture itself, but everything that made it possible, and everything it meant. There is something about the Atlantic campaign that resists simple storytelling. It was not fought in a single week or decided in a single battle. It was fought every day, in every season, across millions of square kilometers of open ocean, by men who rarely saw the enemy face to face, and who measured success in tonnage rather than territory. It was a war of mathematics and endurance, of improved radar and broken codes, of convoys zigzagging through fog, and submarine commanders lying motionless on their bunks, working probability equations in their heads, while their crews slept fitfully around them. Kretschmer understood this kind of war better than almost anyone on either side. He understood it not because he was a reckless genius who trusted instinct, but because he studied it. He treated convoy hunting the way a surgeon treats an operation, with preparation, with precision, with a complete intolerance for unnecessary risk. Where other U-boat commanders fired from distance and hoped, Kretschmer closed the gap. He preferred surface attacks at night, slipping inside the convoy's own defensive screen and firing at almost point-blank range, then moving quietly before the escorts could organize a coherent response. It was audacious in the extreme, and it worked with a consistency that made his superiors increasingly nervous that they would eventually lose him. They were right to worry. Because here is the other side of the story, the one that makes Kretschmer more than just a statistic in a naval history textbook. He was not invincible. No commander is. And the same ocean that had protected him, that had swallowed his victims and hidden his escapes, was slowly being transformed by the very forces his success had helped accelerate. Every ship he sank made the British work harder, think more clearly, build faster. Every Allied loss was also a lesson, and by the time U-99 set out on its final patrol, the Atlantic was no longer the same ocean it had been when Kretschmer first learned to love it. The British were getting better. Their escort commanders were more experienced. Their coordination was tighter. Their radar was improving. And something else was shifting too. Something harder to quantify, but just as real. The confidence that had carried the U-boat fleet through its golden period was beginning to fray at the edges. Not for Kretschmer specifically, not yet, but for the campaign as a whole. The ocean was tightening around the wolves. What follows in this documentary is the complete story of how that final patrol unfolded. We will begin at the beginning, with a young man from a naval family, learning what it meant to command, to fail, to adapt, and to endure. We will move through the years of his ascent, the patrols that made his name, the tactics that made him exceptional. We will trace the slow shift in the Atlantic's balance of power that made his capture possible. And then, we will follow U-99 on its last voyage, hour by hour, decision by decision, until that cold morning when everything ended and something else, something more complicated and more human, began. This is not a story that celebrates war. Anyone who has spent time with the primary accounts, the survivor testimonies, the after-action reports, the memoirs written decades later by men still trying to make sense of what they lived through, knows that there is nothing to celebrate in the drowning cold of the North Atlantic. What there is, instead, is something worth understanding. A story about skill and limitation, about the moment a commander chooses his crew's lives over his own escape, about what respect looks like when it crosses enemy lines, about what it means to be the best at something, and then to lose. If you are here to settle in for the evening, to let the grey Atlantic wash over you while history unfolds at a pace that respects your time, you are exactly where you should be. This channel exists for exactly this kind of night. If you have not already, now is the moment to subscribe, to make sure that when the next long-form documentary arrives, it finds you ready. Get comfortable. The water is deep, and we are only just beginning to dive. Because somewhere in the North Atlantic, in water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes, a submarine is preparing to surface for the last time. And the man standing at its controls is thinking not about glory, not about records, not about the medals already pinned to his chest. He is thinking about his crew, 40-odd men in a steel tube, trusting him completely, waiting for whatever he decides next. He has already made his decision. He just hasn't told them yet. The Atlantic Ocean does not forgive. It has no memory of the ships it swallows, no record of the men it keeps. It simply moves, grey and cold and indifferent, churning beneath clouds that press low against the water, as though trying to smother what lies beneath them. In the years between 1939 and 1945, that ocean became the most contested stretch of water in human history, a corridor of survival upon which the entire Allied war effort depended. Merchant vessels crossed it in tight formations, hoping that numbers offered protection. Escort warships patrolled its edges with growing anxiety, and beneath its surface, hunting in darkness, moved a force that came closer than almost any other to severing the lifeline that kept Britain breathing. Among that force, one man stood apart from all the rest. His name was Otto Kretschmer. He was not the loudest voice in the German submarine service. He did not make speeches or court attention or fill the newspapers with the kind of theatrical bravado that the Reich's propaganda machine so desperately craved. He was quiet, methodical, and precise, in a profession that often rewarded recklessness. He wore his decorations with the same composed expression he brought to everything else, the look of a man who had already calculated the next move before the current one had finished playing out. His fellow officers respected him in the way that serious men respect other serious men, not with warmth exactly, but with the particular recognition that comes from watching someone do a difficult thing with uncommon skill. His enemies, in time, would come to respect him too. The Atlantic was, in the early years of the war, a place where the mathematics of survival worked heavily in the U-boat's favor. The German submarine fleet operated under a doctrine called tonnage warfare, a cold, industrial logic that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with arithmetic. If submarines could sink Allied merchant shipping faster than shipyards could replace it, the war would be won not by any single battle, but by the slow, patient bleeding out of an entire economy. Every freighter that went down took with it food, fuel, ammunition, raw materials, the physical substance of resistance. Kretschmer understood this calculus better than almost anyone. He had not come to the Atlantic to find glory. He had come to do a job, and he intended to do it with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. He had been born in 1912, in a part of Germany that would later become Poland, in a household shaped by discipline and order rather than sentiment. The details of his early years are not dramatic. There is no single episode from his childhood that announces the coming of a great predator. What there is, in the record of those years, is a consistent picture of a young man who absorbed instruction carefully, who questioned what did not make sense, and who was not content to follow procedure when observation suggested a better path. These are not the qualities that make men famous. They are the qualities that make men effective. The German Navy recognized something in him early enough to place him on a path toward submarine service, and that assignment would define the rest of his life. His early patrols, before he took command of the vessel that would make his reputation, were learning exercises in the most literal sense. The sea teaches the same lesson in different languages, depending on what it wants you to understand, and what it taught Kretschmer in those first patrols was that patience was not weakness. It was the most powerful weapon available to a submarine commander. Other men pushed forward when conditions were uncertain. Kretschmer watched and waited. Other men fired when they had a reasonable chance. Kretschmer waited until he had a good one. The difference between a reasonable chance and a good one, multiplied across dozens of engagements, was the difference between a middling record and a historic one. The tactics that made him famous were not invented overnight, and they were not the product of genius working in isolation. They emerged from a rigorous process of observation and refinement, from the willingness to look honestly at what had worked and what had not, and to adjust accordingly. Where many U-boat commanders relied on longer-range torpedo shots from submerged positions, Kretschmer developed a preference for night surface attacks conducted from inside the convoy's own escort screen. It was a technique that required nerve of an almost abnormal quality. To take a submarine into the middle of a convoy, surrounded by merchant ships and their escorts, and to work there with measured calm. But the geometry favored him. Inside the screen, the escort's own formation made it difficult for them to attack without risk to their own charges. It was a calculated insolence, and it worked. The nickname they gave him, Silent Otto, was not, as some have assumed, a reference to stealth in any simple sense. It referred to something more specific, his fire discipline, the rule he followed and enforced rigidly in his crew was one torpedo, one ship. No second shot to confirm, no wasteful spread fire. One torpedo, aimed with care, fired with confidence. In an era when torpedoes were precious and their mechanical reliability was not always guaranteed, this discipline was both an economic necessity and a statement of professional pride. It said, "I do not need a margin of error. I do not miss." The record he built over the years of his operational career bore that claim out with a weight of evidence that was impossible to dispute. By the time the war had run through its first 2 years and into its third, Kretschmer's confirmed tonnage had climbed to a figure that no other submariner in the war, on any side, would ever equal. He had sunk more Allied merchant shipping than any other U-boat commander in history. The number ran past 200,000 tons, a figure that, set against the total weight of steel and cargo that crossed the Atlantic, represents not just a military achievement, but an almost incomprehensible accumulation of loss. Ships that had names and crews and cargo manifests, that had sailed from ports in America and Canada, loaded with the material of survival, had gone to the bottom, in part because one man in a steel cylinder had made very good decisions under very great pressure. The Reich recognized him with its highest decorations. His photograph appeared in newspapers. He was the kind of figure that wartime propaganda services reach for instinctively, proof that their cause produced exceptional men, that the war was being won by superior skill and will. But Kretschmer's relationship to this attention was characteristically detached. He was not unaware of his own achievement, and he was not falsely modest. But he understood, perhaps better than those who celebrated him, that the Atlantic was a dynamic system, not a fixed one. What worked today would be counted tomorrow. The advantage he had built was real, but not permanent. The question was not whether the Allies would adapt, it was when, and how fast. That question was already being answered in ways that were not yet fully visible. Deep in British naval intelligence, in rooms that smelled of tobacco and old paper, analysts were working through problems that had nothing to do with valor and everything to do with mathematics and cryptography. Convoy routing was being refined. Escort numbers were growing. Technology that could find a submarine by its sound, by its heat, by the faint disturbance it made in the electromagnetic spectrum, was being pressed toward operational capability with urgent seriousness. The ocean that had been so cooperative, that had opened for Kretschmer and his peers, and offered up such terrible harvests, was slowly, invisibly changing character. The Predator's advantage was not gone, but its expiration had been scheduled. None of this was apparent in the early months. From the deck of a U-boat, or from the chart table inside a cramped control room, the Atlantic in those years still looked like a hunting ground. Kretschmer continued to patrol, to hunt, to calculate. His crew trusted him with the specific, total trust that forms between men who have faced death together and survived because their leader made the right calls. There was no question among them about his competence. There was perhaps, in the quieter moments, a question that no one spoke aloud. The question that accumulates in any long campaign fought at close quarters with death. How long can this continue? The answer to that question was already moving toward them across the water, wearing the shapes of destroyers and the sounds of engines at full speed. What Kretschmer represented, in those years before his capture, was something that the war would eventually make obsolete on both sides. The singular practitioner, the individual whose skill was so refined and so dominant that it altered the strategic picture by the force of one man's professional excellence. Wars are ultimately decided by systems, by industrial capacity, by logistics, by the ability to replace what is lost faster than the enemy can destroy it. But they are prosecuted by human beings, and sometimes a human being arrives who seems to operate at a different level of mastery than those around him. Kretschmer was that kind of figure. He had made himself, through years of disciplined study and ruthless self-improvement, into the most effective submarine commander the war would produce. The ocean had educated him. The question that the coming months would answer was whether education alone was enough. He did not begin as a legend. He began as a boy from Silesia, the son of a headmaster, raised in a household where discipline was not imposed but expected. Otto Kretschmer entered the German Naval Academy in the early 1930s as one cadet among many, unremarkable in appearance, quiet in manner, and possessed of a watchfulness that his instructors either admired or found unsettling, depending on their disposition. He was not the loudest voice in any room. He was, almost invariably, the one listening while others talked, filing away every detail, every mistake, every lesson that crossed his path. His classmates remembered a young man who seemed to process the world at a slightly different speed than everyone around him, slower on the surface, faster underneath, like the very vessels he would one day command. That quality, that patient interior machinery, would define everything that followed. The German Navy of that era was in reconstruction, rebuilding itself under constraints and ambitions in roughly equal measure. For a young officer of ability and application, the path upward was defined by technical mastery first and strategic thinking second. Kretschmer excelled at both, but it was the second that set him apart. His fellow officers studied the mechanics of warfare, the instruments, the tables, the procedures. Kretschmer studied the psychology of it. He wanted to understand not merely how ships moved, but why commanders made the decisions they did, and where those decisions created gaps that a patient opponent could exploit. That instinct, to look past the visible surface of a situation toward the invisible structure beneath, was not something the Academy taught. It was something he arrived with and slowly learned to trust. His early years in the surface fleet gave him a foundation that many submarine officers lacked. A working knowledge of how convoy escorts thought, how destroyer commanders scanned the horizon, what patterns of vigilance looked like from the outside. He studied the surface navy with the attention of someone who knew he would one day face it from below. When the submarine arm began to expand in earnest during the mid-1930s, Kretschmer requested transfer. It was not a fashionable choice at the time. Submarines carried a residual stigma from the previous war, and the surface fleet retained its prestige. But Kretschmer was not interested in prestige. He was interested in effectiveness, and the submarine, correctly employed, struck him as the most effective instrument available for the kind of war he expected was coming. He was right, though the scale of what came would have exceeded even his calculations. His first operational command was U-23, a smaller, older vessel than the boats he would later command, a training ground as much as a weapon. The Atlantic in those early patrols was not yet the hunting ground it would become. The war was young, the convoys not yet fully organized, the escorts not yet hardened by experience. A lesser commander might have taken easy early successes as confirmation that the task was simple. Kretschmer took them as data. Each patrol was an examination of variables: weather, light, sea state, escort positioning, merchant spacing, the predictable rhythms of convoy formation that emerged when he looked at enough of them. He kept meticulous notes. He built, patrol by patrol, a mental library of patterns and deviations that would eventually constitute the most sophisticated private tactical database in the Atlantic U-boat fleet. The early patrols were not without their difficulties, and the difficulties taught him more than the successes. There were attacks that failed, torpedoes that missed, targets that turned at the wrong moment, escorts that reacted faster than anticipated. Each failure entered the ledger with the same methodical attention as each success. He did not rage at missed shots, or blame the machinery or the crew. He traced the failure back to its source, identified the decision or the assumption that had created it, and revised the model accordingly. His crew noticed this quality early. A commander who did not panic in failure was unusual. A commander who treated failure as information was rarer still, and they trusted him for it in a way that pure success could not have built. One near capture in those early months crystallized something important in his thinking. U-23, running on the surface during what Kretschmer had calculated to be a safe window of darkness, was caught by an escort that had altered its patrol pattern in a way his model had not predicted. The boat crash-dived, endured a short depth charge sequence that was more frightening than damaging, and eventually slipped away. For many commanders, the lesson would have been caution. Dive earlier, stay deeper, avoid the surface. Kretschmer drew the opposite conclusion. The escort had found him because he had been predictable. The answer was not to retreat from the surface, but to become less predictable on it. He began to study variability itself, how to build unpredictability into his own behavior while continuing to exploit the predictability of others. This was the philosophical core of what would become his method. While other commanders debated the merits of submerged versus surface attack, Kretschmer was working on a different question entirely. Not where to be during an attack, but how to make himself impossible to locate before one began, and impossible to track after one ended. The night surface approach, which he would later refine into an art form, emerged from these early experiments. By running on the surface in darkness, he used the U-boat's low profile and high surface speed to close with convoys at angles that radar and lookouts were poorly positioned to cover. He was not the first submariner to attempt night surface attacks, but he was the first to systematize them into a reliable tactical doctrine built on observation rather than bravado. The psychological dimension of his approach was equally distinctive and equally deliberate. Kretschmer understood that fear was a weapon with a half-life. An escort commander who had survived one night attack would be more vigilant the following night, his attention drawn outward, his pattern of search altered by the trauma of the previous encounter. This was generally understood in the fleet. What Kretschmer grasped that others did not was the corollary. A convoy that had been attacked once and survived intact, that had seen a U-boat driven off and heard no further threat, would relax. The fear would fade, the lookouts would tire, the escorts would settle back into the comfortable rhythms of routine. He learned to exploit that relaxation with a patience that his more aggressive contemporaries simply did not possess. Some of those contemporaries were brilliant by any measure, and several were daring in ways that Kretschmer admired, even when he considered them reckless. The U-boat arm in those years was not short of capable men or audacious commanders. What distinguished Kretschmer from the boldest of them was his relationship with risk. He did not dislike risk. He was simply unwilling to accept risk he had not first examined, classified, and either mitigated or consciously chosen to bear. The commanders who relied on luck, who treated the Atlantic as a stage for individual heroism, achieved impressive results in favorable conditions, and suffered catastrophically when conditions turned against them. Kretschmer's results were not always the most spectacular in any given month, but they were consistent, and consistency in an environment defined by violent randomness was its own form of genius. By the time he transitioned away from U-23 toward larger commands, the education was essentially complete. The specific instrument would change, the tactical refinements would continue, but the foundational architecture of how Otto Kretschmer understood warfare as a problem of information, patience, psychology, and controlled risk, rather than courage alone, was already fixed. He had absorbed the Atlantic's lessons in a way that his training had not anticipated, and his instructors could not have designed. The sea itself had been his classroom, and every near miss, every failed attack, every patrol that ended without a confirmed kill had contributed as much to his formation as the successes that filled the record books. There is a certain kind of professional excellence that only becomes visible in retrospect, when the full arc of a career can be traced back to its foundations. In Kretschmer's case, the foundations were not dramatic. There were no singular moments of revelation, no single patrol that made him. There was instead a long, quiet accumulation of observation, of failure, of revision, of refinement, that eventually produced the commander who would hold the record for tonnage, sunk longer than anyone in the history of submarine warfare. The legend did not spring fully formed from the waters of the Atlantic. It was built, methodically and without fanfare, in exactly the manner you would expect from a man whose classmates remembered him as the one who listened while the others talked. He had always been learning. The Atlantic simply gave him something worth learning from. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a submarine pen when a new commander arrives. Not the silence of fear, exactly. Something closer to held breath. The men who line up along the dock, engineers, torpedomen, watch officers, radio men, they have heard things. Rumors travel faster than orders in the German Navy of 1940, and the name Otto Kretschmer had already become a kind of shorthand among the submarine corps. He was the man who did not waste torpedoes, the man who did not speak unless speech was necessary. And so when he walked the length of that pen to take his first look at U-99, the crew standing at attention read his expression for clues and found almost nothing, which told them everything they needed to know. U-99 was a Type 5 submarine, a vessel that sat at the practical center of Germany's U-boat construction program at the time of her commissioning. She was not the largest boat in the fleet, nor the most heavily armed in absolute terms, but she was a capable, agile machine, built for exactly the kind of warfare that Kretschmer had already begun to perfect. At roughly 67 meters in length, she carried a complement of 14 torpedoes, a deck gun of 88mm caliber, and the engineering systems necessary to sustain extended Atlantic patrols. Her diesel engines could drive her on the surface at a speed approaching 17 knots, and submerged, her electric motors kept her moving at a fraction of that. Patient, quiet, predatory. She was not a palace. The crew of roughly 40 men shared cramped bunks in shifts, breathed recycled air, and lived within a steel tube that felt both intimate and brutally indifferent to comfort. But she was built to kill ships, and Kretschmer intended to use her to do precisely that. The assignment of U-99 to Kretschmer was not accidental. By 1940, the mechanics of U-boat command selection had evolved well beyond simple seniority. Success mattered, results mattered, and the German submarine arm, operating under the direction of Admiral Karl Dönitz, was an organization that promoted on merit, with a speed that peacetime navies rarely permitted. Kretschmer had already demonstrated on his previous command, the smaller coastal boat U-23, that he possessed qualities that were genuinely rare: patience, precision, and an almost preternatural ability to read the geometry of surface engagements. He had brought his boats home. He had sunk ships that other commanders had passed over, dismissed as too well escorted or too difficult. The Navy's assessment of him was clinical and clear. He was ready for a frontline Atlantic command, and U-99 was ready for a commander who could realize her potential. What Dönitz understood, and what Kretschmer embodied more fully than almost any of his contemporaries, was that a submarine is only as dangerous as the mind directing it. The vessel itself is a tool, a complicated, lethal, extraordinary tool, but a tool nonetheless. The torpedo is not the weapon. The captain is the weapon. This philosophy shaped how crew selection for U-99 proceeded. Kretschmer had opinions about the men he wanted. He was not reckless in his choices, and he was not sentimental. He wanted men who understood that discipline was not a performance for inspection, but a practice for survival. He wanted watch officers who could read sea conditions accurately at 3 in the morning after 6 hours on the bridge. He wanted engineering staff who could diagnose a problem in a diving system without the luxury of consultation or second opinion. The selection process was methodical, and when it was complete, the crew of U-99 reflected their commander's character: quiet, capable, and deeply serious about their work. The relationship between a U-boat commander and his crew existed in a category separate from most military hierarchies. The physical closeness alone, men moving past each other in passageways barely wide enough for one person, sharing meals in shifts within arm's reach of torpedoes, compressed the usual distances of rank into something more direct and more demanding. A captain's mood, his confidence or anxiety, his certainty or doubt, transmitted through the hull of the boat as surely as the sound of the enemy's propellers. Kretschmer was aware of this. He had understood it aboard U-23, and he brought that awareness to U-99 from the first day. He did not perform confidence for his crew. He did not deliver speeches. What he offered instead was competence, visible, consistent, unremarkable in its presentation, and extraordinary in its effect. Men who served under him later described a particular quality of calm that settled over the control room when he was present. Not the calm of passivity, but the calm of a man who had already thought through the next 3 problems and was not alarmed by any of them. The weeks of preparation before U-99's first operational patrol under Kretschmer's command were filled with the unglamorous machinery of readiness. Torpedoes loaded and inspected, navigation charts studied, communication protocols reviewed, diving drills run until they became automatic, until the sequence of actions required to take a 67-meter steel vessel from surface to safe depth could be executed in the dark, by feel, by muscle memory alone. Kretschmer participated in these preparations with the same attention he brought to everything. He was not a commander who delegated the details and waited for results. He was present in the torpedo room. He was present in the engine spaces. He asked questions that demonstrated he already knew most of the answers and was testing whether his crew did as well. The effect on morale was considerable. Men work harder for a commander who works alongside them. Men trust a captain who respects the machinery they operate. There is something important to understand about the German submarine service in 1940 that context alone can provide. This was not yet the grinding, catastrophic campaign that the later years would become. In 1940, the U-boat arm was ascendant. Losses were still manageable. Successes were accumulating with a frequency that astonished even those orchestrating them. The Atlantic felt, from the German perspective, like a sea of possibility, vast, poorly defended in many areas, and filled with the merchant traffic that kept Britain alive. Kretschmer took command of U-99 within this moment of relative confidence, and the men who crewed her understood that they were stepping into a campaign that was going well. But Kretschmer himself, and this was characteristic of him, was not intoxicated by the mood. He saw what was working. He also saw the margins within which it was working, and he was not naive about how those margins might narrow. His reputation arrived aboard U-99 before he did, and it shaped the crew's expectations in ways that cut in multiple directions simultaneously. On one hand, serving under the most precise torpedo marksman in the fleet meant a certain reflected status. On the other hand, it meant a standard of performance that would not be relaxed. Kretschmer was known to be demanding about preparation and relentless about learning from error. He did not shout, he did not humiliate, but his silence after a mistake carried its own weight, and every man aboard understood that silence as clearly as a reprimand. This created an environment in which errors were genuinely feared, not because of consequences to the individual, but because the whole boat functioned as a unit, and a mistake by one man in the wrong moment could end the lives of 40. That understanding, once internalized, is a different kind of discipline than anything a uniform or a rank badge can impose. The commissioning formalities themselves were brief by the standards of peacetime ceremony. The war had shortened rituals, focused attention on function rather than form. Documents were signed, officers were confirmed in their roles. The boat was officially designated operational under Kretschmer's authority, and the period of harbor preparation began in earnest. There was no fanfare proportionate to the significance of what was being assembled: a man, a machine, and a crew that would together account for more Allied shipping than any other combination in submarine history. History rarely announces its more consequential pairings at the moment they form. The significance arrives later, assembled from the wreckage of what was lost and the records of what was accomplished. What Kretschmer brought to U-99, that no technical specification could capture, was a philosophy of warfare that was genuinely his own. Where other commanders relied on spreads of torpedoes, firing multiple weapons at a target to compensate for uncertainty, Kretschmer shot once, carefully, at close range. He preferred to attack from within the convoy itself, having navigated through the escort screen on the surface at night, invisible against the dark sea, moving slowly enough to avoid a bow wave that might catch a lookout's eye. This approach required extraordinary nerve and exact judgment. It also required absolute confidence in his crew, because a single error in navigation or noise discipline while inside a convoy screen could be fatal within minutes. The crew of U-99 trained toward this standard. They had to. Their captain would accept nothing less than the precision his method demanded. By the time U-99 left on her first operational patrol under Kretschmer, she was a functioning instrument of a very particular kind of intelligence. The machine and the man had been matched with deliberate care, and the crew had been selected and prepared with the same methodology that Kretschmer applied to everything. The Atlantic waited ahead, grey, cold, enormous, and filled with the merchant convoys that carried the material of Britain's survival. Kretschmer had studied those convoys. He had thought about their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their escort arrangements, the hours of night when they were most exposed and least vigilant. And in the cramped, oil-smelling interior of a 67-meter steel vessel, 40 men prepared to follow him into that calculation. They did not know yet what the patrols ahead would bring. They knew only that their captain had studied war as a craft, approached it as a discipline, and had so far brought every crew he commanded back alive. That, in 1940, was the most reliable currency of trust a submarine could carry. The Atlantic, in the winter of 1940, was not a place of mercy. Storms rolled in from the northwest without warning, icing the decks of merchant ships and warships alike, pressing convoy columns into ragged, irregular formations that straggled across hundreds of miles of grey water. For the men aboard those vessels, the cold was an adversary almost as formidable as any weapon. But for Otto Kretschmer, standing on the bridge of U-99, with the salt wind cutting his face and his binoculars raised against the horizon, the cold was simply background. It was the world in which he worked, and he had learned, with a patience that bordered on the meditative, how to work it very well, in fact. His first patrols aboard U-99 were not spectacular in the way that German propaganda preferred. There were no single, overwhelming engagements, no dramatic lone charges through the heart of a defended convoy. What there were, instead, were results. Quiet, cumulative, methodical results that accumulated in the ledger of Allied losses with a consistency that began to alarm British naval planners more than any single dramatic action might have done. Kretschmer did not seek headlines. He sought tonnage. And in that single-minded, almost bureaucratic pursuit of sunken displacement, he was without peer in the German submarine fleet. His commanders noted the numbers. His peers noted the silence with which those numbers grew. The tactic he had refined, though he would have been reluctant to call it anything so formal, rested on a single operational insight that most submarine commanders of the era had failed to fully absorb. A surfaced U-boat at night was nearly invisible. Its silhouette, low and dark against the swells, was almost impossible to pick out against the black water from the bridge of a merchant vessel or even an escort. And on the surface, the diesel engines gave U-99 a speed advantage over the submerged crawl that battery power allowed. Kretschmer used this. Where other commanders dived at the first sign of trouble and waited for conditions to improve, he stayed on the surface for as long as nerve and circumstance permitted, maneuvering freely inside the convoy columns themselves, firing at close range, and relying on precision over volume. One torpedo, one ship. It was not glamorous. It was devastatingly effective. Early in the 1940 campaign season, U-99's patrol log began filling with confirmed kills. Tankers went down, carrying fuel that the British Isles desperately needed. Dry cargo vessels carrying grain, timber, and war materials slipped beneath the surface in the hours before dawn, their crews scrambling into lifeboats in water that could kill an unprotected man within minutes. Kretschmer's approach to these attacks carried a hallmark that his crew came to recognize instinctively. He pressed in closer than felt comfortable, closer than doctrine suggested, until the target filled the entire periscope or the bridge night glass, and there was no margin left for error, and then he fired. The closeness was not recklessness. It was the elimination of all the variables that could convert a competent shot into a miss. At those ranges, the torpedo had almost no room to stray. Aboard the boat, the crew developed the particular discipline that Kretschmer's command style demanded. He was not a man who shouted. Officers who had served under louder, more expressive commanders sometimes found the silence aboard U-99 unnerving at first. He gave orders once, in a level voice, and expected them executed. He did not offer elaborate praise for routine competence, because he considered routine competence the baseline beneath which he had no interest in operating. What this created, over weeks and months at sea, was a crew that had internalized his standards so thoroughly that they anticipated his requirements before he voiced them. The engineering watch knew when to coax the diesels quietly. The torpedo crew knew the rhythms of preparation and readiness. The helmsman knew the small corrections that kept them on bearing without instruction. U-99 ran as a single organism, and Kretschmer was its central nervous system. The promotions came as the tonnage mounted. Germany in 1940 was still absorbing the extraordinary speed of its early military victories, and the U-boat arm was one of the few services that could claim genuine, sustained strategic results against an undefeated enemy. The Royal Navy was still the Royal Navy, enormous, experienced, proud, and the fact that German submarines were bleeding it month by month in the waters west of Britain carried enormous symbolic weight for the Reich. Kretschmer's decorations followed a predictable trajectory: acknowledgement, then distinction, then the highest honors the German military awarded. The Knight's Cross came. Later, the oak leaves would follow. Each recognition arrived not as a surprise, but as a bureaucratic confirmation of what the tonnage figures had been saying for months. He received these awards with the same equanimity, with which he received everything else. Yet even as the decorations accumulated, Kretschmer was under no illusions about what his work cost. He was not indifferent to the merchant sailors he sent into the Atlantic. The historical record suggests that on multiple occasions he surfaced after attacks to provide survivors with compass bearings toward the nearest land, with whatever supplies could be spared, and with whatever information might give men in open lifeboats a fighting chance against the sea. This was not a universal practice among U-boat commanders. Some regarded it as a waste of time or an operational risk. For Kretschmer, it appeared to reflect something more durable than policy, a distinction maintained carefully and at some personal cost in time and exposure, between the act of sinking ships and the act of causing unnecessary suffering to the sailors aboard them. It was a line he held. Into 1941, the pace of operations continued, and the tally of sunken tonnage climbed toward figures that would become benchmarks against which every other U-boat commander's performance was measured. Kretschmer was operating in a period when the Battle of the Atlantic had settled into a brutal rhythm. Convoys departing, U-boats deploying in patrol lines, the wolf packs coordinating through Dönitz's headquarters, the escorts doing what they could with the resources available. Within that rhythm, Kretschmer operated somewhat apart. He was not always a wolf pack participant in the conventional sense. His methods were often better suited to independent exploitation of contact than to the coordinated group attacks that doctrine prescribed. Where others waited for the signal to charge in together, Kretschmer had already positioned U-99 inside the convoy's perimeter and was choosing his targets. The convoy columns of the North Atlantic were not the orderly formations they appeared on charts. At sea, in darkness and weather, ships straggled, escorts rushed to respond to contacts. Commodores issued corrections that not every vessel received in time, and the whole enterprise moved with the lurching imprecision of an enormous, frightened herd. Kretschmer understood this. He read the behavior of convoys the way a careful observer reads any complex system, looking for the gaps, the moments of disorganization, the seconds when an escort was turned the wrong way and a target was temporarily unguarded. He had the patience to wait for those moments, even when waiting meant holding his position among the columns in conditions where discovery was always possible. The crew felt that patience is a pressure. They trusted it nonetheless. His confirmed tonnage by the middle of 1941 placed him so far beyond his nearest contemporaries that the comparison had become almost uncomfortable within the U-boat arm itself. Men like Günther Prien and Joachim Schepke were celebrated commanders, genuine experts and decorated officers, and Kretschmer surpassed them in the cold arithmetic of sunken displacement by margins that the official tallies made impossible to dispute. This did not appear to generate animosity among the officer corps. The culture of the U-boat arm, at least in this period, was close-knit enough and the shared danger great enough that professional respect generally held. But the gap was acknowledged. When German naval leadership spoke of the standard of submarine excellence, they spoke of Kretschmer's record. It was a difficult thing to stand next to. What is harder to recover from the historical distance is the texture of those months aboard U-99, the particular quality of life in a steel tube operating in some of the most inhospitable ocean on the planet, run by a man who demanded everything his crew had and supplied. In return, the peculiar security of absolute competence, the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed clothing, the constant motion of a hull that never quite settled, even in moderate seas, the noise of depth charges that fell close enough to crack gauges and snap light bulbs, and the silence afterward when the boat held its depth and waited to learn if the next one would be closer. The meals eaten in rotation because there was barely room for a third of the crew to sit at once. The patrol logs that reduced all of this to positions, headings, times, and the impersonal shorthand of wartime record keeping. By the time U-99's record had reached its height, and the decorations had been presented, and the recognition from naval headquarters in Lorient had become something close to institutional reverence, Kretschmer was already watching the edges of the campaign environment for the changes that his methodical mind could not ignore. The escorts were getting better, the response times were improving, the coordination between vessels that had once been ragged and individual was becoming something more coherent, more dangerous. He did not speak of this openly, because it was not his nature to voice the concerns that he was better served by analyzing in private. But the observations were accumulating in the same precise, unhurried way that everything else in Kretschmer's professional life accumulated, quietly, carefully, and with consequences that would eventually prove impossible to outrun. There is a particular kind of patience that has nothing soft about it. It is the patience of a man who has trained himself to wait, not because he lacks urgency, but because he understands that timing is the difference between a torpedo that strikes and one that passes harmlessly through empty water. Otto Kretschmer had built that patience into himself, the way a craftsman builds tension into a bow, deliberately, over years, through failure and correction, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge that no manual could fully capture. By the time U-99 was cutting through the North Atlantic in the early months of 1941, Kretschmer had developed something rarer than courage. He had developed a method, and a method, properly executed, is far more dangerous than bravery alone. The foundation of that method was observation. Where other commanders moved quickly to close distance and fire, Kretschmer held back. He would spend hours, sometimes the better part of a night, simply watching. From the bridge of a surfaced U-boat, with binoculars raised against the salt wind and spray, he studied convoy formations, the way a mathematician studies a proof, looking for the underlying structure beneath the apparent chaos of ships and smoke and signal lights. He memorized the spacing between vessels, noted the sweep patterns of the escorts, counted the seconds between a corvette's course changes. He was building a map inside his mind, a living diagram of the convoy's rhythms and vulnerabilities, and he would not act until that map was complete enough to trust. His understanding of sea conditions was equally precise. The Atlantic is not a single thing. It shifts between states, calm patches and running swells, fog banks that appear from nothing, moon intervals where cloud cover briefly retreats to flood the surface in cold silver light. Other commanders accepted these conditions as given, working around them or waiting for them to improve. Kretschmer read them as tactical information. A high sea running gave him noise cover for his approach. Overcast skies reduced the risk of silhouetting against the horizon. He knew that an escort crew on a cold, miserable night, after hours of zigzag patrol, was a crew whose attention had begun to fray at the edges. He scheduled his attacks not by the clock, but by the accumulated conditions, when the environment had arranged itself to give him the maximum possible margin. What made him genuinely unusual among his contemporaries was his preference for attacking from inside the convoy. This sounds straightforward written down, but it was almost unimaginably demanding in practice. The standard approach was to fire from outside the screen, from beyond the range of the escorts, at greater distance, accepting the reduced accuracy that came with that distance. Kretschmer rejected this. He would navigate U-99 through gaps in the escort screen while running on the surface, exploiting the U-boat's low silhouette and the darkness, threading between the columns of merchant ships until he was positioned among them. From inside, his firing solutions were clean and close. His targets filled the sight picture rather than appearing as distant shapes on the horizon, and the escorts, whose patrol patterns were designed to face threats approaching from outside, suddenly found themselves dealing with an enemy already within their perimeter. The torpedo discipline he imposed upon his crew flowed directly from this philosophy. Kretschmer fired one torpedo per target, not a spread, not a pair, as insurance against a miss. 1. This practice invited ridicule among officers who considered it unnecessarily risky, who argued that torpedo spreads existed precisely to account for the uncertainties of aim, ship speed, and tidal current. Kretschmer's counter-argument was not spoken in conference rooms. It was demonstrated in results. By closing the range before firing, by waiting until the firing solution had refined itself to something close to certainty, he converted a probabilistic weapon into something approaching a precision instrument. The mathematics worked in his favor. He could carry a given number of torpedoes on any patrol. Every additional shot required to sink a ship was a shot not available for the next target. His economy of fire was not parsimony. It was multiplication. Each torpedo conserved was a future opportunity kept alive. His night surface tactics rested on a single physical truth that he had grasped and exploited, while many others had not fully absorbed it. A surfaced U-boat, seen from the bridge of a merchant vessel or an escort, presents an extremely low profile. At any distance, in any light below the clearest day, it is functionally invisible. The conning tower rises only a few meters above the waterline. The hull is nearly awash. Against a confused background of wavetops and wind-driven spray, it becomes something the eye slides past without registering. Kretschmer understood that this invisibility was his greatest weapon, and he refused to surrender it by diving prematurely. He stayed on the surface as long as the situation allowed, maneuvering with a speed and agility no submerged submarine could match, repositioning between targets with an ease that seemed almost casual to those who heard about it later and could not quite believe what they were reading. The fear that preceded him into any operational area was not accidental. Merchant crews talked. Survivors of sinkings were recovered, questioned, and eventually found their way to other ships and other convoys, carrying with them something that could not be disinfected from the fleet. The knowledge that there was a German commander who appeared from nowhere, who struck precisely, who seemed able to penetrate any escort screen and leave before anyone fully understood what had happened. That fear had a tactical value. Crews under sustained threat fatigue faster, watch discipline degrades. Men who have survived one sinking approach their duties aboard a replacement vessel with a fraction of their original steadiness. Kretschmer did not need to think about this in strategic terms to benefit from it. The atmosphere he had created across the convoy lanes worked for him continuously, whether U-99 was at sea or in port. His crew absorbed his methods through proximity and repetition rather than formal instruction. Kretschmer was not a man given to long explanations or elaborate briefings. He demonstrated by doing, and his crew learned by watching him do it. The officers who stood bridge watchers beside him came to understand his decision-making process through the accumulation of observed choices. This position rather than that one. This moment to fire rather than the one 30 seconds earlier. What had begun as the personal methodology of one commander gradually became the operating culture of U-99 as a vessel, a shared set of instincts reinforced across patrol after patrol until the crew could anticipate his intentions before he voiced them. That unity of understanding between a captain and a crew who had learned to think in similar patterns was itself a force multiplier in ways that no tonnage figure could quite capture. There was also something in his treatment of enemy survivors that set him apart in ways his superiors may not have fully appreciated or encouraged. When circumstances permitted, Kretschmer provided position information to survivors, ensured they had functional lifeboats, and did not depart until he was satisfied they had a reasonable chance of rescue. This was not universal practice among submarine commanders of any nation during this period of the war. His reasons were his own, perhaps rooted in a professional's respect for the merchant seamen who were, in his view, doing a dangerous job without having chosen a fighting life. Whatever the reasoning, this conduct earned him a reputation that crossed enemy lines and would, years later, shape the way the Royal Navy treated him when the positions finally reversed. What drove his tonnage numbers to heights no other submarine commander ever reached was not the accumulation of spectacular individual actions. It was the relentless, disciplined application of a system across month after month of operational patrols. Each patrol refined the system slightly. Each new convoy presented data that fed back into his understanding of escort behavior, of merchant ship handling, of the way convoy commodores adjusted their formations in response to attack. He was not simply repeating himself, he was iterating. The Kretschmer who sailed in the later months of 1941 was a materially more sophisticated tactical thinker than the one who had taken U-99 to sea for the first time, and the gap between him and the average U-boat commander had grown rather than narrowed as the months accumulated. To classify what he had built as a hunting style would be to understate it. Other men hunted. Kretschmer had constructed something closer to a discipline, a coherent body of practice with an internal logic, applicable across varying conditions, resistant to disruption because it was grounded in physical and psychological principles rather than fixed procedures. The Atlantic is enormous, and the convoys moved through it on routes that shifted with Allied planning and weather, and the slow chess game of intelligence on both sides. What could not shift was the underlying reality of a surfaced submarine at night, patient, precise, commanded by a man who had spent years learning to read the sea and the enemy's behavior the way other men read text. That knowledge was the instrument. U-99 was simply the platform it moved through the water aboard. The war, however, was not standing still around him. The same months that had watched Kretschmer's totals climb had also watched the Allied response begin to organize itself into something more coherent and more dangerous. Escort groups were improving. Radar technology was advancing along a curve that would eventually produce equipment capable of finding a surfaced U-boat in darkness that had previously been absolute cover. Code-breaking efforts whose full effects were not yet visible in the operational environment were beginning to feed convoy routing decisions in ways that made the geometry of interception slightly harder, patrol areas slightly emptier. The method that had made Kretschmer the most successful U-boat commander in the history of the war was about to meet a changed world, one that had spent 2 years specifically organizing itself around the problem of stopping men exactly like him. By 1941, the Atlantic had become Otto Kretschmer's ocean, not in the way that admirals claim seas from behind mahogany desks, but in the way a hunter claims a wilderness. Through presence, through knowledge, through a patient intimacy with every mood and motion of the water. He had learned the convoy routes the way a man learns the roads of his own country, not from maps alone, but from memory earned at cost. Other commanders measured their success in patrols completed, and orders followed. Kretschmer measured his, in hulls broken, and cargo lost to the deep. And by the time 1941 reached its midpoint, that measure had grown into something that the German Naval High Command could scarcely contain their pride about. The numbers were not merely impressive, they were, by any standard of submarine warfare, before or since, extraordinary. The confirmed tonnage sinking attributable to Kretschmer across his operational career had by this point exceeded 200,000 tons of Allied shipping. To put that figure in any kind of human context requires a moment of deliberate effort, because raw numbers can flatten the reality they represent. 200,000 tons meant dozens of ships, freighters, tankers, troop transports, each one a floating community of men, machinery, and cargo, each one representing months of construction, thousands of man-hours, and the particular hopes of the merchant sailors who crewed them. Kretschmer had sent all of it to the floor of the Atlantic, not through recklessness or luck, but through the consistent application of a method so refined by this point that it had become almost second nature aboard U-99. He was, by any calculation available to the German Navy's staff officers, the single most effective submarine commander the world had ever produced. Recognition followed achievement the way weather follows season. The decorations came first. The Knight's Cross had already been awarded, and in the culture of the German Navy's officer corps, decorations were not merely ceremonial. They were currency of a specific kind: purchasing influence, assignment priority, and the particular authority that comes from being visibly, publicly valued by the institution you serve. For Kretschmer, the awards accumulated in a way that might have inflated a lesser man. He wore them, but he did not become them. His crew noticed this distinction. The man who stood on the conning tower during a night attack was the same man who walked the narrow passage between bunks when the patrol grew long, composed, precise, and notably unconcerned with the performance of his own significance. That quality, more than any decoration, was what made him genuinely feared. The German propaganda apparatus, which had been watching the Atlantic campaign with the interest of an institution that understood the value of heroes, found in Kretschmer an almost perfect subject. Here was a young officer of obvious intelligence and established results, a man whose record spoke with the authority that slogans could never manufacture. The phrase that would follow him through the remainder of the war and beyond it, the tonnage king, was not born in a naval briefing room, but in the machinery of public attention, the newspapers and radio programs that translated the remote violence of the Atlantic into something the German home front could hold on to. Kretschmer himself expressed little enthusiasm for the role. He understood publicity, the way he understood weather, as a condition to be navigated rather than celebrated. But he also understood that a commander who openly resisted the framing his institution needed would find his operational freedom quietly diminished. He accepted the title and returned to sea. What made 1941 so significant was not merely the accumulation of tonnage, but the conditions under which it was achieved. The Atlantic was not, by this point, the relatively open hunting ground of 1940. Convoy escorts were improving in both number and quality. Allied commanders had absorbed painful lessons from earlier losses and were applying them with increasing rigor. The routing of convoys had grown more sophisticated, the communications between escort vessels more coordinated, the willingness to prosecute a contact with depth charges more confident and sustained. Against this changing environment, the fact that Kretschmer continued to deliver results was itself a form of testimony, not to ideology or national character, but to the specific competence of one individual who had built a system of warfare precise enough to remain effective even as the environment around it hardened. His method had reached full maturity by 1941. The night surface approach, which he had pioneered and refined across dozens of patrols, was now executed with an economy of movement that his crew could perform almost without instruction. U-99 would slip inside a convoy's defensive perimeter in darkness, moving slowly enough to present the smallest possible silhouette against the horizon. Kretschmer would select his targets with the patience of a man who understood that the difference between a successful attack and a catastrophic one often came down to a few degrees of bearing and a few seconds of timing. He fired carefully. He wasted nothing. Where other commanders expended multiple torpedoes in uncertain salvos, he placed single shots with the confidence of a marksman who had taken the time to understand exactly what he was aiming at. The result was a kill rate per torpedo that most other commanders regarded as simply impossible until the evidence accumulated to the point where it could not be ignored. The crew of U-99 existed inside the wake of this reputation in ways both sustaining and complex. Pride was natural. They were part of something that the entire German Navy was talking about, crewing the most successful submarine in the fleet under the most decorated commander afloat. But pride coexisted with the particular awareness that success raises stakes. Each patrol that reinforced the legend of U-99 also reinforced the expectation that it would continue. The men who loaded torpedoes in those cramped forward tubes and listened to the hydrophones in the darkness knew that their captain's method, precise as it was, required them to run extraordinary risks as a matter of routine. The compressed air systems, the battery banks, the diving planes, all of it existed at the intersection of engineering tolerance and operational demand. They trusted Kretschmer, but trust, aboard a submarine at war, is not the same as certainty. Among the ships sent to the bottom during this peak period were tankers, and tankers mattered in a way that freighters did not, at least not in the strategic calculations being made in London and Washington. Fuel was the lifeblood of the Allied war effort, and Kretschmer's consistent targeting of tankers was not accidental. He understood the logic of industrial war, that an army without fuel is a formation without movement, that a convoy route interrupted long enough becomes a supply line that exists only on paper. His selection of targets reflected a strategic instinct that went beyond the simple arithmetic of tonnage. He was not merely sinking ships. He was attempting, patrol by patrol, torpedo by torpedo, to erode the material foundation upon which Allied resistance depended. Whether he believed this effort would ultimately succeed is a question his later writings approach only obliquely. But in the execution of each patrol, the intent was clear enough. The German Naval High Command tracked Kretschmer's results the way a treasurer tracks the performance of a bank's most profitable asset. Staff officers, who might otherwise have dealt in abstractions, found themselves paying close attention to the operational reports coming in from U-99. Here was proof, monthly, quarterly, cumulatively, that the Atlantic campaign was not merely viable, but potentially decisive. Other commanders were performing well enough, but Kretschmer's numbers stood apart from the fleet average, the way a single mountain stands apart from the foothills around it. This created a particular institutional problem that the High Command handled with the pragmatism of people who understood what they had. They used him as a standard, a reference point against which other commanders' performance was measured, which was enormously useful for motivation and enormously unfair to the men being compared. For Kretschmer himself, 1941 was both apex and warning. The same months that saw his tonnage record reach its height also carried the early signals of a changing war. He had watched, with the precise attention he gave to all tactical information, as the escort responses to his attacks grew faster and more coordinated. He had noticed the way that certain convoys seemed harder to locate than their scheduled routes suggested they should be, a detail that he filed without yet understanding its full implication. The British were not merely reacting to U-boat attacks. They were beginning to do something more systematic and more dangerous, something that operated at a level above individual patrol reports and fleet communiques. The shape of that threat was not yet clear to him, but the instinct that had made him effective for so long registered its presence the way a barometer registers a pressure change before the sky has shown a single cloud. There is something almost elegiac in looking back at this period from the far side of its outcome. The tonnage figures are real. The decorations were real. The fear that the name U-99 produced in Allied convoy planning rooms was entirely real. And yet all of it existed inside a window of time that was already beginning to close. Though no one aboard that submarine could see the frame clearly enough to understand its dimensions, Kretschmer had built something remarkable out of discipline and intelligence, and an unusual capacity for calm under conditions that dissolved other men. He had proven, definitively, that submarine warfare could be elevated from a war of attrition into something closer to a craft. The Atlantic had answered him with 200,000 tons of evidence. What it had not yet told him was the price of that answer, or when the bill would arrive. The tonnage king was, in the early months of 1941, at the absolute height of his power, and power of that particular kind, earned in darkness and cold water and compressed air and nerve, carries within it the seed of its own reversal, not because mastery invites complacency in men like Kretschmer, but because the world that mastery operates inside does not stay still. The convoys were learning, the escorts were learning, the technology was changing, and somewhere in the intelligence networks of the Allied war effort, information was accumulating in files that would eventually produce consequences. No single torpedo shot and no amount of patient observation could counter. For now, though, U-99 was the most feared vessel in the Atlantic. For now, the numbers climbed. For now, the ocean still belonged to Otto Kretschmer, and the patrols continued. The Atlantic Ocean, in 1941, was no longer the hunting ground it had been. Otto Kretschmer stood in the control room of U-99, aware that something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of the war. The enemy was learning. Where once the U-boats had moved through convoy routes, like wolves among sheep, now there was resistance, organized, coordinated, and increasingly effective. The early months of that year had brought Kretschmer his greatest triumphs, vessels sinking beneath the waves with remarkable regularity, tonnage accumulating in the official tallies that made him a legend within the Kriegsmarine. But by autumn, as he prepared for patrol after patrol, the atmosphere changed. The sea itself seemed to whisper of danger in frequencies the Germans could not yet measure. Allied countermeasures were tightening, and the tonnage king was beginning to sense the net closing around him. The British had understood something fundamental about submarine warfare that the Germans were slower to grasp. That hunting U-boats required not brilliant individual commanders, but systematic coordination. In the early years of the Atlantic campaign, convoys had been defended by a handful of escort vessels, often poorly equipped and unable to maneuver effectively against a determined U-boat attack. A skilled captain like Kretschmer could exploit vast gaps in the escort screen, slip between the hunters in darkness, fire his torpedoes with clinical precision, and vanish before any meaningful counterattack could form. But the Royal Navy was building better escort vessels now, corvettes and minesweepers, converted to anti-submarine duties, destroyers, and frigates equipped with fresh determination and improved tactics. More importantly, they were developing the organizational discipline to keep U-boats from isolating individual merchant ships. Convoy procedures tightened. Escort vessels learned to maintain station, to communicate through signal, and increasingly through radio direction finding. The days when a U-boat could operate with near impunity were ending, though Kretschmer did not yet fully recognize how completely the game had shifted against him. Radar represented perhaps the most insidious of all Allied advantages, a technology that struck at the very heart of Kretschmer's tactical genius. His success had been built on a foundation of stealth and superior positioning in darkness. Night surface approaches had been his signature method, surfacing under cover of darkness to maneuver ahead of a convoy, gaining positional advantage, and striking from close range, where even poor torpedo performance could result in hits. But now the escorts carried devices that could detect a U-boat's presence through cloud and darkness alike, mechanical eyes that rendered the night no longer impenetrable. The Type Viking U-boats were not fitted with effective radar themselves, leaving them vulnerable to an enemy they could not see or measure in return. Kretschmer's patrols in the latter months of 1941 began to reveal this problem with increasing clarity. Escorts appeared at impossible moments, forcing crash dives before attack positions could be achieved. Convoys seemed to alter course, just as U-99 maneuvered for the perfect firing angle. Something was watching, something mechanical and relentless that did not depend on human sight or sound. The tactical advantage that had made Kretschmer invulnerable was being stripped away, bit, by invisible technology he could neither see nor counter. The British had also broken German naval codes, knowledge they guarded with religious intensity, allowing them to position convoys away from concentrations of U-boats, and sometimes to route them clear of danger altogether. This intelligence advantage operated largely in silence, its effects felt only in statistical anomalies that puzzled German operational planners. Kretschmer noticed the patterns nonetheless, the way convoys appeared in areas where intelligence suggested they should not be, the way acoustic conditions seemed to improve for the escort vessels at crucial moments, as though the British possessed foreknowledge of U-boat positions. German headquarters would eventually suspect the code break, but confirmation came far too late to implement effective countermeasures. The silent war of mathematics and signals operated beneath the surface of direct combat, but its consequences were no less deadly. Kretschmer could not fight an enemy he did not know existed in the form it took, and this gave the British an almost supernatural advantage in the twilight struggle for Atlantic supremacy. The production capacity of the British and American shipyards had become another shadow on Kretschmer's horizon. For every ship his U-boats sank, 2 more seemed to slide down the ways and enter service within weeks. The merchant vessels themselves improved. Faster, better armed with defensive guns and explosive charges, crews trained in evasion and survival. But more significantly, the Allies were building warships faster than the Germans could sink them, expanding their escort capacity even as losses mounted. Kretschmer understood mathematics at an instinctive level. He could calculate tonnage and loss rates as readily as he could read the sea. The numbers were turning against Germany, and the trajectory was clear to anyone willing to face uncomfortable truths. The submarine campaign depended on sinking merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced, on strangling British imports to the point of capitulation. Yet the British and Americans were replacing tonnage at accelerating rates, and American industrial production was beginning to flood the Atlantic with fresh escort vessels, better equipped and more numerous than anything the Germans could field. Kretschmer had understood from the beginning that time was not his ally, that the window for decisive U-boat action was closing. Now, the window was closing faster than it had a year earlier. The Tonnage King's later patrols reflected this shifting balance with stark clarity. In 1940, his patrol success rates had been almost routinely spectacular, single operations yielding tens of thousands of tons of shipping destroyed. By the latter months of 1941, patrol durations were extending, while tonnage figures began to decline. The escorts were more aggressive, more coordinated, and more prepared for U-boat tactics. Attacks that would have succeeded in 1940 now failed, forcing Kretschmer to attempt multiple approaches against single convoys, burning fuel and battling an endurance that U-boats could ill afford to waste. His last great triumph came in the spring of 1941, when the circumstances of superior positioning and enemy error had aligned in his favor for one final moment of dominance. After that, despite his brilliant seamanship and tactical genius, the trend line moved downward. The convoy system was tightening, the escorts were learning, the radar was spreading, and the code break was directing convoys away from danger. Kretschmer was not fighting against nature now, but against industrial civilization, mobilizing its full capacity to counter his methods. The psychological dimension of this shift was no less significant than the technological and industrial factors. Early in the Atlantic campaign, U-boat crews harbored an almost mystical belief in their submarine's invulnerability and their captain's genius. The crew of U-99, serving under Kretschmer's command, had experienced months of almost uninterrupted success. They had witnessed their captain read the sea and position his vessel for kill after kill with an almost preternatural ability. But as patrols extended, as attacks failed or achieved reduced success, as escorts appeared with new technologies and new tactics, that confidence began to fray at its edges. The men understood that something had changed in the Atlantic. The escorts were faster, more numerous, and more skillfully led. The darkness no longer provided the same security. The fear that had been mostly theoretical began to accumulate into something more concrete and present. Crews that had been proud to serve under Kretschmer now served with a different emotion. Respect, surely, but tempered increasingly by awareness of danger that no amount of tactical brilliance could entirely eliminate. The German naval leadership, particularly Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commanding officer of the U-boat arm, was struggling to adapt strategy to these shifting realities. More U-boats were being sent to the Atlantic. Larger wolf packs were being organized to overwhelm escort defenses through sheer numerical superiority. But this represented a shift away from the individual captain's mastery, away from the model that had made Kretschmer a legend. The Atlantic campaign was becoming less a matter of brilliant tactics by elite commanders, and more a matter of attrition and numerical superiority. Kretschmer's genius had been honed in an environment where individual skill could triumph. That environment was disappearing. The reorganization of U-boat operations around Wolfpack tactics meant that even successful commanders would find their autonomy constrained, their decision-making subordinated to coordinated group strategy. The hunting ground that had rewarded Kretschmer's particular talents was transforming into something harsher, less controllable, and more dependent on pure luck and industrial capacity. By the autumn of 1941, Kretschmer had reached the apex of his achievement, the highest-scoring U-boat commander in the history of naval warfare. More than 200,000 tons of Allied shipping resting on his record, respect from both enemies and colleagues who understood the depth of his skill. But he was also a man of sufficient intelligence to recognize that he was entering a different phase of the war. The statistics were available to anyone with access to operational reports. U-boat losses were climbing, success rates were declining, and the burden of maintaining the Atlantic campaign against an increasingly formidable opponent was shifting. Younger commanders would enter the Atlantic in the coming months, facing an environment that Kretschmer's example had helped create, but that his tactics might no longer dominate. The shadows lengthening across the Atlantic were not merely metaphorical. They represented real changes in technology, organization, and capacity that would define the remaining years of the submarine war. The Allied response to the U-boat threat operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and Kretschmer encountered the effects of this coordinated campaign without always understanding the full scope of what he faced. Each individual countermeasure, Improved escorts, radar detection, code breaking, increased production might have been managed, adapted to, and possibly overcome by a brilliant commander with sufficient time and resources. But they arrived in combination, reinforcing each other, creating a tactical environment in which excellence alone was no longer sufficient. The silent Otto had earned his reputation in an earlier age of Atlantic warfare, when skill could triumph decisively against materiel and coordination. That age was ending, though the end was invisible to those living through the transition. Kretschmer continued to patrol, to hunt, to display the tactical brilliance that had made him legendary. But the hunting ground was transforming beneath his feet, and the prey was learning to fight back with resources and technologies that were slowly, inexorably beginning to outweigh the advantages that had made him master of the Atlantic. In the grey winter of 1942, the port of Lorient lay shrouded in Atlantic mist. The French submarine base, now under German control for nearly 2 years, had become the operational heart of the Atlantic U-boat war. Somewhere in those concrete pens, among the other dark hulls resting in their berths, U-99 waited. Otto Kretschmer stood on the dock that morning in early March, his leather greatcoat buttoned against the cold, watching his crew file aboard with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed this ritual many times before. They moved without ceremony or fanfare, no crowds to wave them off, no speeches promising glory. This was the business of war, reduced to its simplest mechanics. Men boarding a steel tube, checking equipment, preparing to depart into an ocean that had grown progressively less forgiving. For Kretschmer, now a Kapitänleutnant, with 46 merchant vessels sunk, and a record that stood unmatched in the entire German submarine service, this departure carried the weight of accumulated reputation. His crew knew they sailed under the command of the tonnage king himself, the man whose name had become synonymous with precision and survival in an arm of warfare where both qualities were becoming increasingly rare. The boat itself was a Type Varick submarine, unremarkable in profile but lethal in practice. A vessel that displaced nearly 770 tons when submerged, and carried 14 torpedoes in her tubes and external racks. U-99 had become an extension of Kretschmer's will, a platform so perfectly adapted to his methods that no other commander had achieved comparable success in her hull. The crew numbered just over 50 men, all volunteers for submarine service, all thoroughly trained in the methodical procedures that kept them alive in an environment fundamentally hostile to human existence. They knew their captain's reputation for coolness under pressure, for the uncanny ability to position the boat with mathematical precision, for the nerve required to hold steady on an attacking surface run while escort vessels closed with guns firing. They had seen him awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the highest military honors the Reich could bestow, and they understood they were part of something unprecedented in the annals of submarine warfare. Yet the ocean itself was changing. The men could feel it in the intelligence briefings, in the increased frequency of enemy patrol aircraft, in the reports of enhanced escort screen composition around Allied convoys. The war beneath the waves was no longer the almost hunting ground it had been 2 years earlier. Departure orders had come through the German Naval High Command with routine efficiency. Kretschmer was assigned an operational area in the North Atlantic, south and west of Iceland, where intelligence suggested convoy routes remained productive. The briefings indicated merchant traffic continued to flow toward Britain and the Soviet Union, though the volume had fluctuated unpredictably as the Allies adjusted their routing and increased their defensive measures. Kretschmer received the coordinates and timing with the professional demeanor of a commander who had absorbed dozens of similar patrol assignments. Yet something beneath the surface of those meetings conveyed awareness that the tide was shifting. The ratio of successful attacks to boats deployed had declined throughout 1941. Older commanders were being retired or reassigned. The focus had begun to shift toward new technologies and tactics. The development of enhanced radar countermeasures, the concept of the Rudel tactic or wolfpack formations, where multiple U-boats could coordinate attacks against a single convoy. Kretschmer's style, refined through hundreds of hours of solitary stalking and individual tactical brilliance, belonged to an earlier chapter of the war that was slowly closing. He did not speak of this, of course. A captain did not burden his crew with such reflections. He checked the provisions manifests, reviewed the navigation charts, and verified that every system aboard the boat functioned within specifications. The voyage from Lorient to the operational area consumed several days of transit through waters that remained dangerous, despite German U-boat dominance in the region. The Bay of Biscay had become increasingly hazardous, patrolled by Allied aircraft equipped with radar and equipped to attack submerged submarines. Kretschmer took U-99 down to operating depth, maintaining silent running protocols, conserving battery power for the long underwater transit. The crew settled into the routine they understood intimately, the watches rotating through the compartments, the diesel engines throttled back to whisper quiet, the men moving with practiced silence through a boat where the air grew thick and stale within hours of submerging. In the control room, Kretschmer maintained his characteristic position of calm authority, studying the charts, listening to the hydrophone operator relay the distant sounds of enemy vessels and passing neutral ships. The darkness around them was absolute and pressing, the pressure hull holding back hundreds of fathoms of Atlantic water, the steel groaning softly as they descended to their cruising depth. No man among the crew felt fear in the conventional sense. Fear was a luxury they could not afford, but all of them possessed acute awareness that they existed in an environment that would kill them instantly if any significant breach occurred. This awareness sharpened their attention, concentrated their focus on the mechanical systems that kept them alive. As U-99 transited toward her assigned operational area, the wider Atlantic campaign context formed the true backdrop to her mission. The war in the Atlantic had evolved into something far more complex than the early patrols of 1940, when German submarines operated with almost unchallenged freedom. By the time Kretschmer sailed in March of 1942, the Allies had implemented systematic improvements across multiple domains. Convoy escort vessels had increased in number and capability, equipped with modern depth charge patterns and improved sound detection equipment. Radio intelligence operations had made substantial progress in understanding German naval codes, providing advance warning of U-boat patrol areas, and allowing convoy routing officers to steer merchant shipping around known danger zones. Aircraft equipped with radar now hunted the Bay of Biscay with lethal persistence. American shipyards had begun producing escort vessels at a rate that would eventually overwhelm German construction capacity. The seemingly endless supply of merchant ships in the early years of the war had proven less endless than anticipated. While British and American production was enormous, it required protection, and the protective capability was growing. Intelligence summaries that Kretschmer would have reviewed before departure made these trends evident to any commander capable of reading between the lines. The window of opportunity that had existed in 1940 and early 1941 was narrowing. This final patrol departed into waters where the hunter's advantage had begun to erode. The operational area itself held promise despite these larger trends. Convoy SC-86 was known to be operating in the region Kretschmer was assigned. A slow convoy of merchant vessels plodding across the Atlantic on the Scotland to North America route, heavily laden with cargo destined for Britain. Intelligence had provided approximate positioning and course data, the kind of tactical information that Kretschmer could use to position himself for an intercept. The mathematics of Atlantic convoy warfare were brutally simple. Determine the convoy's position, calculate its course and speed, position the U-boat in its path, and execute the attack using methods refined through years of practice. Kretschmer possessed the intellectual and practical tools to execute this calculation flawlessly. He had done so more than 40 times with devastating success. The question that neither he nor his superiors could fully answer was whether the defensive measures surrounding that convoy had evolved beyond his tactical capacity to penetrate them. The crew aboard U-99, however, did not concern themselves with such abstractions. They were sailors following orders, taking their boat to sea, because that was their profession and their duty. The war's larger trajectory remained the province of admirals and staff officers. For men living in a steel compartment breathing recycled air, the immediate reality consisted of their captain's competence, the reliability of their equipment, and the fortune that attended any dangerous enterprise. The passage into the operational area extended over several days, with U-99 maintaining her submerged transit until reaching patrol depth in waters where the density of enemy activity decreased substantially. Kretschmer brought the boat to the surface for brief periods to run her diesel engines and recharge batteries, maintaining constant vigilance for patrol aircraft or enemy warships. The periscope watch rotated through trained operators who scanned the horizon with the methodical attention of men whose lives depended on spotting danger first. Weather conditions in the North Atlantic during March tended toward the brutal, heavy seas, visibility limited by rain and spray, temperatures that made topside watch a trial of endurance for the rating assigned to the watch officer's position. The crew adapted to these conditions as they always had, accepting them as part of the cost of operating in these waters. Discipline aboard remained absolute and voluntary, the product of Kretschmer's reputation and the professional standards he maintained throughout his boat. Men worked their stations knowing their captain would demand perfection in the execution of their duties and would reciprocate with the kind of tactical decision-making that maximized their chances of survival. It was not a relationship based on affection or ideological commitment, though some crew members may have felt both. It was fundamentally professional, built on mutual understanding of competence and consequence. The atmosphere aboard U-99 during this transit embodied the odd mental state that characterized submarine operations. Boredom and tension coexisted in ways that landlubbers could barely comprehend. For the majority of the crew, the hours consisted of routine maintenance, watch standing, meals in shifts because the boat was too cramped to accommodate the entire crew eating simultaneously, and the various small tasks that filled the days and nights. Yet beneath this surface, routine ran constant awareness that they were entering hunting waters, that within days or hours they might transition from transit status into active engagement with enemy vessels. The gun crew checked their armament repeatedly. The 88mm deck gun positioned forward of the conning tower had served Kretschmer well on numerous occasions, and they maintained it with meticulous care. The torpedo officers checked the mechanical and electrical systems on each of the 14 weapons aboard, verifying firing solutions and propulsion mechanisms. The engineering crew inspected every valve and gauge in the diesel and electric propulsion plants. This was the ritual of a crew preparing for combat, executed with the calm deliberation of professionals who understood that poor preparation translated directly into death. Kretschmer moved through the boat during these preparations, with his characteristic reserve, observing without constant supervision, allowing his officers and men to execute their responsibilities with the autonomy they had earned through competence. By the early days of March 1942, U-99 had transited into her assigned area, and Kretschmer had shifted the boat to an interceptor posture. The operational plan was standard: patrol the estimated convoy route, hunt through the available water space for merchant traffic, and exploit opportunities when prey appeared. Kretschmer was now operating at the apex of his powers, possessing the experience of more than 40 successful attacks and the psychological resilience that comes from having survived countless hours of depth charging and pursuit. His reputation preceded him, even in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. British intelligence had identified U-99 as one of the most dangerous boats operating, and convoy commanders were specifically warned to maintain heightened defensive vigilance if this submarine was reported in their operational area. Yet Kretschmer himself was simply a man doing his job, executing the tactics he understood, maintaining the discipline he required of himself and those under his command. He had no way of knowing that this patrol would be his last, that the machinery of war was already in motion that would transform him from hunter to hunted. The ocean ahead held no visible indication of the change about to occur. The convoy routes remained lethal to Allied shipping. The U-boat arm maintained apparent dominance in its assigned hunting grounds, and the future appeared an extension of the present that had proven so successful for the exceptional commander, now searching the Atlantic for merchant prey. Intelligence regarding convoy SC-86 suggested that the merchant ships would be moving through Kretschmer's patrol area sometime in the middle of March, a time frame that aligned perfectly with U-99's fuel consumption and operational schedule. Kretschmer had fuel and torpedoes sufficient for multiple attacks if the opportunity presented itself. His crew was rested and ready, their confidence in their captain and in their vessel absolute. The weather conditions, though harsh, matched the conditions Kretschmer had mastered in previous operations. All the material factors appeared aligned for another successful patrol, culminating in multiple sinkings, another accretion to his unprecedented tonnage record, another reinforcement of the reputation that had made him the symbolic embodiment of German U-boat superiority. The boat moved through the grey waters with the silence and purpose of a predator entering familiar hunting grounds. No man aboard possessed any premonition of what awaited them, no collective intuition that this departure marked a fundamental threshold in the war beneath the Atlantic. They were sailors executing their duty, following their captain toward what they expected to be yet another triumphant patrol. History, however, does not announce itself in advance. The machines of warfare continue their operations according to orders and logistics and intelligence estimates, and commanders execute the missions assigned to them, unaware that the moment of their greatest vulnerability often arrives disguised as routine obligation. U-99 had begun her final hunt, and the hunter-killer vessels that would transform her captain from aggressor to prisoner were already moving into position across the winter Atlantic. The Atlantic in early 1942 was a different ocean than it had been 12 months before. The waters still stretched endlessly in all directions, grey and cold beneath skies that rarely broke into clarity. But the rhythm of the hunt had changed. For Otto Kretschmer, commanding U-99, those changes were not abstract strategic realities, discussed in operations briefings, thousands of kilometers away in Lorient or Berlin. They were tangible, immediate, and embedded in every hour of this patrol. The wireless reports that crackled through the boat's receiving apparatus spoke of increased convoy escorts, of new detection methods employed by the British, of American destroyers now patrolling alongside their allies with growing confidence. Yet none of this knowledge could prepare a man or a crew for the peculiar combination of restlessness and discipline that defined the days of stalking. U-99 was searching the Atlantic for convoy SC-86, a designation that meant nothing until it became everything. The crew had departed their base in Lorient approximately 1 week prior, slipping through the Bay of Biscay during darkness and maintaining a westerly course toward the deep waters where merchantmen congregated. Kretschmer himself had guided the boat through the most dangerous portion of the journey, the relatively shallow waters of the French coast, where Allied aircraft and patrol vessels posed constant threat. Once clear of those narrows, the U-boat had settled into the rhythm that all submariners knew, the endless routine of battery management, engine efficiency, fuel consumption calculations, and the perpetual rotation of men through confined spaces that stank of diesel oil, human sweat, and the ineffable smell of steel and humidity that no amount of ventilation could completely dispel. The crew numbered approximately 45 men, a mixture of veterans who had served under Kretschmer for months or years, and newer hands still learning the protocols that kept a submarine functioning at maximum efficiency. Each man understood his function in the hierarchy of the boat, from the chief engineer monitoring the diesel engines to the radio operators maintaining constant vigilance for enemy transmissions, or coded orders from headquarters, from the torpedo mechanics who maintained the weapons that gave U-99 its lethal purpose, to the lookouts who would soon man the conning tower during surface operations. The search itself was a discipline of patience, married to calculation. Kretschmer had received intelligence reports before departure that indicated convoy activity in a specific region of the mid-Atlantic, a zone roughly 700 kilometers west of Ireland, where the patterns of merchant traffic and escort movements suggested profitable hunting. The term profitable carried multiple meanings in the vocabulary of submarine warfare. It meant tonnage, the measurement of cargo capacity destroyed, which translated directly into strategic damage to Allied supply lines and war production. For Kretschmer himself, profitability also meant precision, the satisfaction of planning executed flawlessly, the methodical devastation of targets that had been stalked with the patience of a predator that could afford to wait because waiting meant survival and success. The boat traveled on the surface during daylight hours, when visibility was limited and risk of detection was minimized by the sheer vastness of the ocean and the limitations of enemy reconnaissance methods. Kretschmer maintained a steady speed that balanced fuel efficiency against the need to cover ground efficiently, moving in a search pattern that would intercept merchant vessels traveling along the predictable shipping routes that all convoy commanders understood. The tension aboard U-99 during these days of stalking was not the sharp, immediate anxiety of combat or the grinding stress of depth charging. Instead, it was a peculiar form of psychological pressure that accumulated slowly, a tension born from the combination of boredom and anticipation that dominated the submarine experience. The men moved through their duties with the mechanical efficiency of long practice, checking instruments, recording data, performing maintenance tasks that kept the boat in fighting condition. Yet beneath this routine lay a constant awareness that something could change at any moment, that the monotony of endless ocean could transform in seconds into the chaos of contact and attack. The younger crew members, those who had not served under Kretschmer for extended periods, felt this tension acutely, sensing in the bearing and tone of their captain and senior petty officers a preparedness that went beyond normal vigilance. The veterans, by contrast, had learned to compartmentalize the waiting, to occupy their minds with routine tasks and informal recreation, card games played in whispers, conversations conducted in the limited space of the crew's quarters, the consumption of the meager rations that submarine service provided. Kretschmer himself moved through the boat regularly, not with the restlessness of an anxious commander, but with the calm assessment of a professional who had conducted this same hunt dozens of times before. The hours of daylight were particularly grueling, the long stretches of visibility requiring constant vigilance to ensure that no Allied aircraft appeared on the horizon, no patrol vessel stumbled across their position. U-99 remained on the surface because this was the optimal position for searching vast distances of ocean, the vantage point that allowed a U-boat to spot smoke rising from merchantmen long before those ships could detect the submarine. The risk of air attack during daylight was real, but manageable if the watch was alert and the visibility limited. If an aircraft appeared, the boat could be submerged in less than a minute. The crew trained through countless drills to move instantly to diving stations, to seal all hatches, and begin the descent that would carry U-99 into the safety of the deep. The lookouts stood watch on the conning tower with special binoculars, their eyes scanning the horizon in a methodical pattern, watching for any anomaly that might indicate the presence of enemy vessels or merchant ships worth investigating. They were relieved regularly to prevent the mental fatigue that came with sustained concentration. Each 4-hour watch, followed by longer periods below decks, where men could rest or attend to their duties in the cramped interior of the boat. The nights were the domain of the attack, and it was in these hours of darkness that Kretschmer's particular genius manifested. As evening settled across the Atlantic, the boat's profile became nearly invisible to enemy observation, a dark shape on a dark sea, detectable only by radar or hydrophone if the British possessed the technical capability and the tactical positioning to employ such systems effectively. The crew knew that these were the hours when probability shifted in their favor, when the methodical stalking could conclude and direct engagement could begin. Kretschmer himself would rise to the conning tower as darkness approached, taking personal command of night operations and conducting the U-boat into positions of advantage with the precision that had made him legendary throughout the U-boat service. His movements were economical, his orders precise, and spoken in low tones that were heard by only those immediately around him, a habit born partly from security protocol and partly from a commander's understanding that calm authority transmitted more effectively in whispers than in shouts. He would use the darkness to move U-99 into positions ahead of estimated convoy routes, calculating the likely speed and course of merchant ships based on intelligence reports and his own accumulated experience of convoy behavior. During these nights of stalking, the crew maintained a state of readiness that was physically and mentally demanding. The torpedo room crew remained at a heightened state of alert, their weapons armed and ready, the targeting mechanisms prepared to deliver death to ships that carried vital supplies to Allied ports. The engineers stood ready to vary speed or course on command, to provide maximum power if an attack was needed, or to shift to quiet running if stealth became the primary requirement. The radio operators continued their surveillance of electromagnetic spectrum, listening for the transmissions of convoy escorts that might indicate the proximity of a British warship, or for any other signals that could provide tactical advantage. Kretschmer's sonar operators, the men who heard through the U-boat's listening equipment the sounds of the ocean around them, maintained constant vigilance for the signatures of merchant ships and escorting vessels. A trained ear could distinguish the rhythm of different types of engines, could calculate approximate range and bearing from the acoustic signatures that traveled through water with surprising clarity. It was a skill that combined science with intuition, technical knowledge with the kind of pattern recognition that came only from years of experience. The emotional state of the crew during these days was complex and multifaceted, resistant to simple characterization. There was anticipation, surely, the eagerness of men who had signed on for this service, with the understanding that combat was the purpose of their sacrifice and their expertise. There was also an undercurrent of fatigue, the wear that accumulated from the close quarters, the constant tension, the poor air quality that grew progressively worse as the boat operated submerged for longer periods, and the air became fouled by diesel exhaust and human respiration. Some men experienced genuine fear, though they would never have articulated it in such terms, instead speaking of the ordinary hazards of the service or the need to remain focused on tasks. Others exhibited the psychological detachment of experienced warriors who had conducted the hunt so many times that the prospect of violence had lost much of its emotional charge. There was camaraderie here as well, the deep fellowship that forms among men who depend upon each other for survival in dangerous circumstances, who share privations and fears and small victories that the outside world would never fully comprehend. Kretschmer understood these currents within his crew, understood that a commander's task during the waiting period was not merely to search for enemy vessels, but to maintain the psychological equilibrium that separated a crew functioning at maximum efficiency from one paralyzed by stress or despair. The search patterns that U-99 employed were systematic and based on Kretschmer's accumulated knowledge of British convoy operations. He understood that merchants traveling from North America to Britain followed routes that optimized distance while providing as much protection as possible from wolf-pack concentrations that German headquarters had assigned to various ocean sectors. He knew the approximate timing of convoy departures from ports like Halifax or New York, the likely loading composition of merchant vessels, and the probable arrangement of escort formations. This knowledge was not the result of imagination or speculation, but rather derived from careful study of attack reports filed by U-boat commanders throughout the previous year, from intelligence summaries passed through official channels, and from the tactical experience of a submarine commander who had spent more than 1,000 days operating in the Atlantic. Kretschmer and his crew were not searching blindly across empty ocean, but rather moving through a space where they possessed a genuine, if incomplete, understanding of where enemy commerce would likely appear. The days of stalking were thus a focused search within a probable zone, a methodical covering of likely corridors where the next target might emerge from the vastness of the sea. Time aboard a submarine in transit, stretched and compressed, according to unpredictable psychological rhythms. Hours felt like days when a man was confined in his bunk in the torpedo room, breathing air that had been recycled through the boat's limited ventilation systems, waiting for an alarm or a message that would call him to action. Days felt like minutes when a man was engaged in work that demanded concentration and skill, when his attention was fully occupied by tasks that required the application of expertise. For Kretschmer and his officers, the passage of time was marked by position fixes calculated from stellar observations during brief surface moments, by the regular receipt of wireless signals carrying updates on other U-boats' locations and success rates, by the mundane rhythms of watch changes and crew rotations. They existed in a state of suspended animation between the boredom of the search and the terrible intensity of contact, between the professional routine that defined submarine operations and the intimate violence that would follow if they succeeded in locating their target. The crew understood on some level that they were approaching the climax of this patrol, that the days of stalking were narrowing toward a resolution, though none could have predicted precisely when or how that resolution would arrive. The tactical brilliance of Kretschmer during these days of stalking lay not merely in the sophisticated navigation and position calculation that directed U-99 toward likely contact points, but in the psychological discipline that he maintained and transmitted to his crew. Other submarine commanders might have chafed at the extended periods without engagement, might have taken risks in frustration, might have pursued unlikely targets at costs that would not have justified the tactical gain. Kretschmer possessed the patience born of confidence, the belief that if he maintained his search pattern and remained alert, contact would come when the circumstances were optimal, rather than merely when contact became possible. He had demonstrated this capacity throughout his career, had proven time and again that the commander who could wait for the perfect moment was infinitely more successful than the commander driven by impatience or desperation. As U-99 continued its methodical pattern across the grey Atlantic, as the crew maintained their state of readiness through long hours of tedium and vigilance, none aboard could have recognized that these were the final days of unrestricted hunting in this particular chapter of the war. The days of stalking were drawing to a conclusion, though the stalker himself did not yet understand that his role in the Atlantic conflict was approaching its final act, that very soon the predator would become the prey, and that his mastery of the hunt would be tested in ways that all his accumulated experience had not prepared him to face. The Atlantic in early 1942 was a hunter's ocean, and Otto Kretschmer had spent nearly 2 years perfecting the art of seeing what others could not. His eyes, trained by countless patrols, had learned to read the horizon like a book written in grey water and shifting light. On the morning of the 16th of March, the crew of U-99 stood at action stations, their captains silent on the bridge, as a merchant convoy emerged from the mist to the northwest. The vessels materialized gradually, first as dark smudges against a lighter sky, then as distinct forms, freighters, tankers, and the invaluable cargo ships that kept Britain alive. This was convoy SC-86, and Kretschmer had found it. The U-boat lay still on the surface, her diesel engines barely turning over, her silhouette low enough against the dawn that she remained invisible to the distant merchantmen. Around him, his crew of 44 men breathed quietly, understanding with the wordless certainty of veterans that their captain had located prey. The hunt, which had consumed long days of empty Atlantic, was about to yield its harvest. Kretschmer did not attack immediately. Patience remained his cardinal virtue, the quality that separated him from the reckless commanders whose tombstones now lay at the bottom of the ocean. He needed to understand the convoy's composition, its course, the number and positioning of its escorts. The British, he knew, had improved their protection considerably since his first commands, nearly 2 years earlier. What once might have been 4 or 5 escort vessels had become something more formidable. Through the periscope during brief daylight dives, he counted the shapes moving around the merchant ships, British destroyers and corvettes, alert and patrolling in practice patterns. The knowledge settled into his mind like a game being played by worthy opponents. These escorts would be commanded by experienced officers, men who understood that a U-boat would come, that somewhere in the grey waste of the Atlantic, a predator circled their flock. Kretschmer calculated distances, wind direction, the angle of approach that would give him the greatest advantage, while exposing U-99 to the least danger. Every decision flowed from years of accumulated experience, from dozens of successful attacks that had taught him the precise moment when caution transformed into opportunity. The daylight hours demanded invisibility. Kretschmer took U-99 deep, far beneath the convoy's sight, where his hydrophone operator could track the distant sounds of merchant ships and escort vessels moving through the water. The operator sat in his narrow compartment, headphones clamped to his ears, listening to the acoustic signature of the convoy. The rhythmic throb of merchant ship propellers created a particular sound, different from the sharper, faster beat of military vessels. Through the listening equipment, the Atlantic became a chorus of engine noise, water movement, and the grinding persistence of human ships crossing an indifferent ocean. Kretschmer moved his boat with the deliberation of a master, positioning himself ahead of the convoy's projected course. He had calculated that the merchant ships would maintain their current heading through the night, and he intended to be waiting when darkness fell and opportunity arrived. Below, the U-boat became a place of constraint and waiting. The crew remained at reduced stations, though every man understood that action could come at any moment. The air grew thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of diesel oil and human bodies packed into steel corridors. Time moved differently underwater, measured not by clocks, but by the slow consumption of battery power and the gradual wearing of nerves. As afternoon faded toward evening, Kretschmer brought U-99 back to the surface. The convoy had moved ahead and to the starboard, passing safely clear of the U-boat's position. He needed to reposition, to place himself once again in the merchant ship's path. The surface was rougher now, with the wind building slightly from the west, the waves becoming more pronounced. To Kretschmer, these conditions were favorable. Darkness would come soon, and in that darkness, his U-boat would be nearly invisible, despite sitting on the surface, in plain sight of any lookout who happened to glance in exactly the right direction at exactly the right moment. The crew worked quickly and efficiently, adjusting the boat's course and depth, positioning the torpedo tubes for attack. Kretschmer stood on the bridge, his lean frame silhouetted against the fading light, watching the horizon with the intensity of a man who understood that the next few hours would determine success or failure. His first watch officer stood beside him, ready to relay orders, ready to move the U-boat instantly if an enemy escort appeared. The gunners stood at their stations, prepared to service the deck gun if circumstances called for it. Everything was prepared, arranged, ready. All that remained was the approach and the moment of attack. Night fell completely by 8 o'clock in the evening, and Kretschmer began his approach. U-99 moved slowly, her engines nearly silent, creeping toward the convoy from ahead and slightly to the side. Kretschmer had maneuvered his boat into this position hours earlier, and now the merchant ships, moving at roughly 7 or 8 knots, were approaching him. The captain stood motionless, occasionally raising binoculars to his eyes, searching for the distinctive shapes of the escorts. The British destroyers would be somewhere in this darkness, patrolling, watching for exactly the situation that was developing. But the night was deep and moonless, and the Atlantic accepted few visitors without making them earn their way. The range closed slowly, 3,000 meters, 2,500 meters, 2,000 meters. Kretschmer could see the shapes of the freighters now, their dark hulls barely distinguished from the darkness around them. Somewhere forward came the distinctive sound of a British escort, her engines carrying across the water, her crew alert and watching. The captain's jaw tightened slightly as he processed the information. The escorts were more numerous than his intelligence had suggested, and they seemed to be moving in coordinated patterns, suggesting command and discipline from whoever controlled the convoy's defense. At just before midnight, Kretschmer ordered U-99 into position for the attack. The U-boat was now inside the convoy itself, surrounded by merchant ships, moving on the surface at the convoy's speed, while invisible to the British eyes that searched the darkness. The torpedo setup was complete. The target was a large freighter carrying supplies that the captain knew would be vital to British operations. The distance was close now, close enough that evasion would be nearly impossible if they were detected, close enough that accuracy was guaranteed. Kretschmer gave the order to fire, and the first torpedo slipped from its tube with a sound that only those aboard U-99 could hear, a distinct throb of compressed air and mechanical release. The torpedo ran true through the darkness, its engine burning steadily as it drove toward its target. Aboard the freighter, the merchant crew would have had perhaps 30 seconds of warning as the torpedo struck home amidships. The explosion that followed was sudden and violent, a burst of flame that lit the convoy like a signal flare that turned night into a moment of terrible brightness. The merchant ship shuddered and began to list, mortally wounded, her back broken by the explosive power of the torpedo warhead. Kretschmer watched without triumph, without emotion, seeing only the result of a calculation made weeks earlier in his briefing, of a patience that had extended through days of hunting. But the convoy's response came with a ferocity that Kretschmer had not anticipated. The British escort vessels, positioned exactly where discipline and experience had taught them to be, reacted within seconds. A destroyer, HMS Walker, that had been patrolling the convoy's port side, spun instantly toward the location of the explosion, her guns tracking and ready. The other escorts converged with the precision of a choreographed movement, each vessel moving to its assigned position with the discipline of a practiced drill. More alarming to Kretschmer was the rapidity and coordination of the response. The British were not acting as individual ships reacting to a crisis. They were executing a prepared defense, a planned response to exactly the situation that had just occurred. Kretschmer made his first calculation of danger and recognized that the simple attack he had planned was transforming into something far more complex. The escorts had him boxed now, or nearly boxed, and they would not be satisfied with driving him off. They intended to kill or capture U-99, and they had the numbers and the proximity to make that intention viable. Kretschmer's second move came rapidly. A straggling freighter, separated from the main convoy's protective cluster, offered itself as a secondary target. The captain ordered the U-boat to surface gun attack, reasoning that quick surface action could finish the merchantman before the escorts closed the distance. The deck gun crew scrambled topside, undoing the securing mechanisms, swinging the weapon toward the target. The gunners worked with practiced efficiency, loading, aiming, adjusting for wind and distance. The first rounds cracked out across the darkness, and the merchant ship's hull was struck repeatedly. But this was the point at which Kretschmer's advantage evaporated entirely. The destroyer HMS Walker had closed to approximately 3,000 meters, and her captain, realizing that a German U-boat had surfaced and was engaging a merchant vessel, took the only decision possible. The destroyer's guns came to life, her crew firing with immediate and coordinated purpose. Shells burst near U-99, sending spray and fragments across the conning tower, forcing the captain and his gunners to comprehend that they were now under fire from a major warship. Kretschmer's surface gun action, which had been his instrument of confidence and control throughout his career, had become a liability. The British could see him now, could track him, could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. The decision came in seconds. Kretschmer gave the order to cease fire and crash dive, a command that sent the gun crew scrambling below like men pursued by demons. The vents opened, the main ballast tanks flooded, and U-99's bow began to angle downward into the Atlantic. The escape hatch slammed shut behind the last man down, securing the conning tower just as another salvo from HMS Walker screamed past overhead, missing the diving U-boat by mere meters. The ocean received the submarine once more, pulling it down from the surface, where it had briefly been a surface warship, into the depths where it would be something else entirely, a hunted vessel fleeing through an element that was no longer safe. The transformation was absolute and immediate. Where Kretschmer had been the hunter moments earlier, circling his prey with the patience of a predator, he was now the hunted, and the British captain aboard HMS Walker was beginning an engagement that would consume the next hours with relentless purpose. The advantage that had seemed so complete, so assured, had shifted in the span of seconds. Kretschmer understood that his final patrol had just entered a new and infinitely more dangerous phase. U-99 descended into darkness, leaving behind a burning freighter and a group of Allied escorts who were now entirely focused on a single objective: the destruction or capture of the tonnage king and his boat. Below the surface, the acoustic picture transformed entirely. The escort vessel's engines became louder, more distinct, their movement patterns clearer to the hydrophone operator straining to track them. The first depth charges were already falling, thrown in patterns by the escorts as they swept across the area where U-99 had submerged. The explosions were distant at first, relatively harmless, the British throwing depth charges in a general effort to chase the U-boat deeper or damage it sufficiently that escape became impossible. Kretschmer controlled his breathing, issued orders in a calm voice that his crew found reassuring, even as the boat shuddered with distant explosions. The crew moved with the efficiency of men who had trained for exactly this circumstance, though none of them could have predicted how long this circumstance would continue, or how final its conclusion would prove. The Atlantic had become a place of immediate consequences, and every man aboard understood that the hunt had fundamentally reversed its direction. The surface attack was Kretschmer's domain, his mastery forged across 2 years of Atlantic warfare. On the night of the 17th of March, 1942, as U-99 moved through waters southwest of Ireland, that mastery faced its greatest test. The convoy SC-86 had been located after days of careful surface stalking, and Kretschmer had already achieved one success. A freighter struck and sinking, its hull collapsing beneath waves that cared nothing for national flags or cargo manifests. The escort vessels had reacted with predictable urgency, drawing away from the main body of merchant ships to investigate the attack, to search for the U-boat that had struck from darkness. This was the moment Kretschmer had learned to recognize, across hundreds of patrols, the window of opportunity that opened when defenders reacted to a strike, when their attention scattered across a suddenly disordered tactical situation. In the vast Atlantic night, with waves rolling beneath a clouded sky, the tonnage king prepared for the surface gun action that had become his signature. The close-quarters warfare, where precision mattered more than firepower, where nerve mattered more than tonnage of steel. U-99's deck gun was a 7.5-centimeter weapon, modest by the standards of surface warships, but devastating against the thin hulls of merchant vessels, never designed to withstand combat fire. The gun crew mustered on deck, moving with the practiced efficiency that came from dozens of similar engagements, their hands steady despite the cold Atlantic wind and the perpetual danger that came with surfacing in hostile waters. Kretschmer stood on the conning tower, his eyes scanning the darkness with the intensity of a man who had learned to read the invisible world of the ocean. He had identified a merchant vessel that had fallen behind the main convoy body, a straggler separated from the protective cluster of the main group by perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers. The escort vessels were occupied elsewhere, their attention drawn by the burning wreck of the ship already struck. Their radar and hydrophone operators focused on searching the waters where the U-boat had recently attacked. To Kretschmer, steeped in the accumulated knowledge of successful predators, the straggler represented exactly the kind of undefended target that the Atlantic War was designed to hunt down and destroy. The gun crew trained their weapon on the merchant vessel, and for a moment, the precision that had earned Kretschmer his reputation seemed poised to claim another victim, another entry in the ledger that had made him the most successful U-boat commander alive. The first shells left the 7.5-centimeter gun, with the sharp crack that punctured the night air, the muzzle flash lighting the conning tower and casting brief, violent shadows across the faces of the crew. The merchant vessel, caught unaware and undefended against sustained surface fire, began to burn, flames climbing from its struck superstructure as the gun crew continued their work with methodical precision. Kretschmer watched the fire spread, calculating the time required for the ship to sink, already composing in his mind the entry that would record this engagement in his war diary. The moment felt like countless others that had come before, a repetition of success that had defined his entire submarine command. But on this particular night, in this particular stretch of the Atlantic, the rhythm that had sustained Kretschmer through 2 years of warfare was about to break with sudden and irreversible violence. The escort vessels, alerted by the gun flashes illuminating the darkness, by radio reports from the stricken merchant ship, by the unmistakable sound of surface gunfire carrying across the water, reacted with the coordinated fury of defenders who had finally located their quarry. HMS Walker, the senior escort destroyer in the group, turned toward the flashing gun position with the acceleration of a warship suddenly released from uncertainty, her own weapon systems coming to bear on the submarine, now silhouetted against the fire of her own kill. The closing of the gap happened with the brutal speed of surface naval combat. The escape window that had existed mere moments before slamming shut with the finality of a steel trap. Kretschmer saw the destroyer approaching, her hull cutting through the waves with inexorable purpose, her gun crews preparing to engage. The tactical calculation shifted in an instant from attack to defense, from hunter to hunted. The gun crew on U-99's deck, already committed to their surface engagement, faced a sudden and catastrophic shift in their situation. HMS Walker's guns opened fire, shells screaming through the night air toward the submarine that had made the fatal error of remaining on the surface a fraction of a second too long. The destroyer's targeting was not perfect. Night surface gunnery against a small, moving target was always imprecise, but precision was not required. The U-boat's deck gun crew, faced with incoming fire from a heavily armed escort destroyer, found themselves in a situation where human bravery meant nothing against the reality of industrial warfare's mathematics. Kretschmer made the decision that his reputation now depended upon, the choice that separated commanders who survived from those who perished in shallow graves beneath the Atlantic. He ordered the gun crew below decks immediately, abandoning the surface gun engagement and ordering U-99 to crash dive. The transition from surface attack to emergency submerged maneuver unfolded with the compressed urgency of a submarine crew suddenly transformed from attackers into refugees, fleeing imminent destruction. Men scrambled from the deck gun position, their movements urgent but disciplined, as they moved toward the conning tower hatch, understanding with the clarity of long training that every second of delay might mean the difference between escape and catastrophic death. Kretschmer followed them down into the boat's interior, his last glimpse of the surface, the flashes of HMS Walker's guns still firing, shells passing over and around the diving submarine, with the angry certainty of weapons that had found their target. Below decks, the crew moved through practiced routines that had been rehearsed hundreds of times in training exercises and dozens of times in actual combat situations. The diving planes were set to maximum angle, the vents open to flood the ballast tanks, the electric motors engaged to drive the boat downward and away from the surface where the destroyer waited with its depth charges and its coordinated search tactics. The deck gun crew emerged from the conning tower hatch just as the boat's bow began to angle downward, just as the first rush of water began to flood the ballast tanks and pull U-99 beneath the surface into the darkness, where her electric motors and her crew's expertise might offer some hope of survival. HMS Walker's guns continued to fire, even as U-99 slipped beneath the waves, the shells passing harmlessly above the descending submarine, as the night swallowed the boat and restored her to the underwater realm, where she might at least contest the question of survival. The moment marked a threshold that Kretschmer understood with the clarity of a man who had approached it before but never in quite this fashion. The transition from tactical dominance to tactical desperation. The moment when the master of surface warfare was forced into the realm where his mastery could no longer protect him. The gun engagement that had lasted only moments, that had lasted perhaps no more than 2 or 3 minutes from the first shell to the final dive, represented the brutal compression of events that characterized surface naval combat in the Atlantic. In those compressed minutes, the entire dynamic of the engagement had reversed. Kretschmer had struck a merchant vessel that was burning and sinking, a clear success by the standards of U-boat warfare. But in attempting to maximize that success by claiming a second victim through continued surface attack, he had allowed the escort vessels to close within effective gunnery range, had allowed the tactical situation to shift from his control to that of his enemies. Below the surface, in the cold darkness of U-99's pressure hull, Kretschmer began to understand the magnitude of the error he had made. The boat was diving steeply, the crew moving through the emergency procedures that came with a crash dive, the machinery running at maximum stress to achieve the depth necessary for even a temporary escape from the destroyer now hunting from above. The escort vessel's hydrophone operators, trained and experienced in the hunt for submarines, would have heard the sound of U-99's descent, would have tracked the boat's movement through the water with the same methodical precision that the submarine's own operators used to track convoys. Kretschmer knew this because he had hunted his own prey with exactly these tools, had himself tracked the acoustic signature of merchant ships and other submarines through the underwater realm. The knowledge offered no comfort, only the grim recognition that he now faced opponents who understood his tactics, who had coordinated responses prepared specifically to counter the surface attack that he had attempted. The psychological shift that accompanied this recognition was profound. For the first time in his career as a U-boat commander, Kretschmer was not approaching a hunt as the inevitable victor, but rather as a hunted animal, fleeing from a coordinated enemy that had turned the tables through superior position and superior numbers. The depth charging would begin soon, and when it did, Kretschmer would be forced to confront the reality that the Atlantic surface warfare that had defined his career was now giving way to a new kind of contest. The battle would be fought below the waves, in darkness absolute and suffocating, with the boat's air supply dwindling with each passing hour, and the escort vessels above patient and determined to finish what they had begun. Kretschmer's reputation as the tonnage king, built across 2 years of successful hunts, of merchant vessels sent to the bottom by his command, of his own cunning and skill, matching itself against the vast resources of the Allied convoy system, would now be tested in a completely different arena. The surface gunfire had lasted only moments, but those moments had accomplished something that Kretschmer's many enemies had failed to accomplish across 2 years of warfare. They had taken away his advantage, had forced him into the one combat environment where his mastery was contested, where his opponents possessed weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter his every move. As U-99 descended through the cold Atlantic waters and HMS Walker's hydrophone operators tracked her acoustic signature from above, the outcome of this engagement was no longer in doubt. The tonnage king had entered the realm of his own subjects, the depths, the darkness, the suffocating pressure of water and steel and human fear, where his reign would finally end. The Atlantic darkened as night deepened around the submerged U-99. What had begun as Kretschmer's hunt, his signature tactic of patient predation, had transformed into something far more terrible, a reversal so complete that the hunter now swam in the cold, crushing embrace of the hunted. The crash dive had lasted only minutes, but those minutes had rewritten the operational calculus entirely. Above the submarine, in the darkness and spray of the surface, two British escort vessels now owned the water. HMS Walker, commanded by Captain Frederick John Walker, one of the most skilled and relentless anti-submarine officers in the Royal Navy, had assumed control of the hunt. Alongside him, HMS Sharpshooter maintained position, her crew alert and coordinated. Together, these two destroyers possessed something Kretschmer had not encountered in such overwhelming measure before: superior intelligence about his exact position, combined with the tactical doctrine and equipment to exploit it. The psychological weight of that reversal, moving from the calculated aggression of surface attack to the suffocating vulnerability of underwater evasion, pressed against every man aboard the U-boat like the sea itself. In the control room of U-99, Kretschmer stood motionless, listening. His crew, trained through years of Atlantic patrols to interpret the metallic language of their vessel, now existed in acute silence. No orders were shouted. No unnecessary movement disturbed the weight of concentration that filled every compartment. The hydrophone operator, positioned at his sensitive listening apparatus, became the only voice that mattered in those dark hours. His headset relayed the acoustic signature of the British escorts, the rhythmic pulse of their propellers, the frequency of their diesels, the directional bearing that marked them as separate points of threat in the three-dimensional space above. Kretschmer had faced depth charge attacks before. Every successful U-boat commander who had survived into 1942 carried the scars, literal and psychological, of repeated bombardment from above. But the British tactics coordinating against him now represented something more sophisticated than simple harassment. They possessed a coordinated search pattern. They were not reacting randomly to acoustic contacts or visual sightings. They were executing a methodical, geometric approach designed to cover every possible avenue of escape. The crew of the U-boat, numbering approximately 45 men, mechanics, engineers, gunners, radio men, torpedo specialists, and the officers who commanded them, now faced a test that transcended training. At cruising depth, roughly 80 to 100 meters below the surface, the submarine existed in a state of extreme vulnerability. The battery, the vessel's only source of power while submerged, would discharge steadily as they remained underwater. Every kilometer of evasion demanded energy they could not replace. Every maneuver to avoid the British ships consumed amperes that could never be recovered. The fundamental physics of the submarine demanded a choice: move and escape, or lie silent and hope the hunters passed overhead. Kretschmer had to calculate not merely his position relative to the British escorts, but the mathematical trajectory of his battery reserve against the growing distance to friendly waters or neutral territory. The engineers working in the hot, diesel-stinking engine room maintained silent readiness, prepared to shift between electric propulsion and battery conservation at their captain's signal. They could not see the enemy. They could not perceive the depth charges falling through the water toward their hull. They could only wait, perform their duties with mechanical precision, and trust that their captain possessed the skill to keep them alive. The first depth charges of this prolonged engagement had already struck. The initial contact with HMS Walker had forced Kretschmer to submerge in haste, a controlled emergency that nevertheless left no time for optimal preparation. The submarine had taken damage, minor at first, but in an underwater environment, minor damage compounded into catastrophic risk. Water seepage through joints not fully sealed during the rapid dive created pinprick streams that the crew attempted to isolate and manage. Electrical systems, exposed to the damp atmosphere of a diving boat, began to show signs of instability. The pressure hull, The inner cylinder of reinforced steel that protected the men from the crushing force of the ocean was designed with elaborate redundancy. But redundancy meant nothing against a coordinated assault by vessels equipped with sensitive sound equipment and the tactical understanding of where to direct their weapons. The British did not need to score a direct hit. The concussive force of explosions near the hull, close enough to shock the structure, to rattle the men inside, to crack welds not yet fully stressed, could accumulate into something worse than any single disaster. HMS Walker maintained the center of the hunt. Her captain, a figure of cold professionalism, who had already claimed multiple U-boat kills and carried the confidence of sustained success. His crew, experienced and coordinated, executed the search pattern with mechanical efficiency. The destroyer moved in measured, overlapping tracks across the area where acoustic signals had last pinpointed the submarine. The destroyers were faster than the U-boat underwater, far faster. Kretschmer could not outrun them. He could not outmaneuver them through superior speed, because the basic arithmetic of underwater propulsion made it impossible. The only advantage he retained was the ability to reduce his acoustic signature to nearly nothing through extreme silence. This meant no propulsion beyond the most minimal creeping movement. It meant no ventilation system beyond the absolute requirement to maintain crew breathing. It meant accepting the accumulation of carbon dioxide, the buildup of stale air, the mounting physical discomfort that came from a submarine holding its breath. Men in the torpedo room lay prone on the mechanisms they serviced, reducing their movement to invisible proportions. The cook extinguished the galley fires. The radio men ceased all transmissions that might create an acoustic pulse giving away position. The psychological world of submarine warfare at this stage of the Atlantic campaign had transformed since the early days when Kretschmer had commanded U-99 with near impunity. The period between 1940 and the first months of 1942 had been, for U-boat commanders, a season of manageable risk. Yes, losses occurred. Yes, submarines fell to depth charges and ramming and anti-submarine vessels. But the scale of protection and the technological sophistication of the hunters had been limited. Radar was not yet widely distributed across escort groups. Hydrophone technology was developing, but not yet perfected. The British still relied heavily on visual detection and basic sound location. Now, as Kretschmer held U-99 in frozen silence beneath the Atlantic, he confronted a different era entirely. The technology surrounding him, not the U-boat's technology, but that of the hunters, had advanced measurably. The coordination between HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter was not ad hoc or improvised. It reflected doctrine, practice, and systematic understanding of how to maximize the probability of a U-boat's destruction or capture. Hours accumulated in the darkness. The timeline became difficult to measure accurately for the crew, because day and night held no meaning beneath the surface, where artificial lighting maintained a constant pallid illumination, and the only markers of time were the periodic updates from the dead reckoning navigation officer and the steady decay of battery charge indicated on the electrical gauges. Kretschmer maintained mental discipline, accepting the mounting discomfort and physical stress as simple operational necessities. His crew, younger than he was, struggled more visibly with the psychological pressure. The weight of the water above, measured in atmospheres of pressure that increased with every meter of depth, pressed against the hull in a constant, grinding force. Men heard the creaks and groans of the steel structure responding to those pressures. Each sound became a potential harbinger of catastrophic failure. In the torpedo room, the weapons that had served as instruments of Kretschmer's legendary success lay inert in their tubes, loaded but unusable. Firing them would create an acoustic signature unmistakable to the British hydrophones, pinpointing the submarine's location with absolute precision. The only weapons remaining to him were maneuver and silence, and the careful management of minimal resources. The British escorts continued their patterns above, their destroyers cutting through the night Atlantic with the systematic patience of hunters who possessed superior numbers and superior technology. They were not hunting desperately or randomly. Every movement of HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter had been calculated to compress the space available to the U-boat, to reduce the volume of water that could conceal it, to funnel it toward capture or destruction. The hydrophone operators aboard the British vessels maintained their acoustic vigilance, listening for the telltale signature of the submarine's electric motors, the cavitation of propellers turning through water, any sound that would betray position. Kretschmer knew, with the clarity born of hard experience, that he faced not individual error, but systematic competence. The British captain commanding this hunt had done this many times. His crew had trained together across multiple engagements. They possessed redundancy in their search methodology. If one ship lost acoustic contact, the other maintained search pattern. Their fuel reserves meant they could sustain this hunt far longer than a submerged U-boat could endure. The crew of U-99 existed in a state suspended between hope and recognition of mathematical reality. Every passing hour consumed battery reserve that could not be regenerated. Every kilometer of attempted evasion moved them toward positions where water depth and coastal geography offered no possibility of escape. The men performed their duties with automatic precision because that was all they could do. The engineer watched his gauges. The torpedo specialist remained ready to respond to firing commands that might never come. The radio man sat at an inactive apparatus, unable to transmit because transmission meant death. The cook waited in the galley beside cold stoves. The crew living quarters, space so confined that men could hardly stand upright, held sailors who existed in darkness and close quarters, and the growing understanding that their captain's legendary skill, however formidable, might not prove sufficient against the specific constellation of forces arrayed against them. Kretschmer stood in the control room, maintaining his bearing, his expression neutral, projecting the confidence that kept his crew from surrendering to despair. But inside that external composure, he was performing calculations with the cold precision of a man who recognized that his options were narrowing with each passing hour, each consumed ampere of battery power, each methodical pass that the British destroyers made across the water above. The night deepened into the early morning hours, and the engagement had not resolved itself through any decisive tactical victory by either side. Instead, it had transformed into a grinding test of endurance, of nerve, of the basic mathematics of underwater warfare. The U-boat could not leave the area without creating sufficient acoustic signature to reveal its position. It could not remain stationary indefinitely because its battery would ultimately expire, leaving it helpless on the surface, exposed to British guns, and no possibility of tactical response. Each passing hour narrowed the corridor of viable decisions. Kretschmer had survived this long by reading conditions with perfect clarity and responding with decisive action. Now, as the dawn approached and the British escorts showed no sign of diminishing their pursuit, he faced a choice point that would define not merely this engagement, but his entire legacy as a commander. The hunt had reversed completely. The tonnage king, the silent Otto, the most successful U-boat commander in the history of the Atlantic, had become, at least temporarily, a man whose survival depended upon the decisions of his pursuers and the physical limitations of the machine he commanded. The psychological weight of that reversal, moving from predator to prey, From the calculated confidence of surface attack to the suffocating vulnerability of underwater evasion, pressed against him with relentless force. Around him, his crew maintained discipline, each man performing his designated role, each understanding that their captain required their steady professionalism to navigate this crisis. Above them, in the darkness and the cold spray of the North Atlantic, HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter continued their systematic hunt, closing the space available for maneuver, denying every angle of escape. The hours accumulated. The battery reserve decreased. The crew of U-99 drifted in the cold darkness beneath the sea, separated from the world above by a barrier of water and steel, listening to the pulse of their pursuers, waiting for a resolution that no one aboard could fully predict or control. The Atlantic Ocean at night holds no mercy for those who cannot escape it. By the time U-99 slipped beneath the surface to evade HMS Walker's guns, darkness had already claimed the water above. But darkness, for Otto Kretschmer and his crew, offered no real sanctuary. It was merely a different kind of prison, one where the walls pressed inward, not from above, but from all directions, from the depths themselves. The submarine descended to operating depth, perhaps 120 meters, far enough to avoid the immediate threat of ramming, but not so deep that the hull would collapse under pressure. Every man aboard understood what had changed in those few minutes of surface combat. They were no longer hunters. The coordination they had glimpsed in the escort vessel's movements, the speed at which that destroyer had closed, the violence of the gun exchange, all of it signaled that the sea itself had turned against them. The crew moved through their stations with the practiced efficiency born from months of training, but efficiency was no longer enough. Survival now depended on factors beyond skill or preparation. The first depth charges came within minutes of submerging. They fell from the hunting ships above, like stones dropped into a well, and when they detonated in the surrounding water, the effect was not noise, but pure physical assault. The explosions created shock waves that traveled through the ocean and into the steel hull, transforming the submarine into a drum being beaten by invisible fists. Men gripped railings and pipes, their knuckles white, their teeth clenched against the percussion. Lights flickered and steadied. A valve near the engine room began to leak, a thin spray of salt water that hissed against hot metal. Kretschmer stood in the control room, feet braced against the coming tower's frame, listening to the hydrophone operator's reports with the focus of a man calculating odds in real time. The escort vessels were not attacking blindly. Their patterns suggested coordination, discipline, the work of experienced anti-submarine crews. One ship alone might have allowed for evasion through depth change or lateral movement. But multiple ships meant coverage, meant triangulation, meant nowhere to go that was not already anticipated. The atmosphere in the control room was not panic, but something colder. The recognition that they had entered a game with rules they could not change. Battery power became the invisible timer on their survival. U-99, like all type-fixed submarines, operated on diesel engines when running on the surface, but depended entirely on batteries for underwater propulsion. Those batteries represented not unlimited energy, but a finite resource that depleted with every meter traveled, with every maneuver, with every attempt to evade. The chief engineer relayed calculations to Kretschmer with the precision of a man stating mathematical absolutes. At current speed, maintaining sufficient battery reserve to surface and run the diesel for recharging would be possible for perhaps 8 to 10 more hours, depending on how aggressively they maneuvered. But aggressiveness meant noise, propeller cavitation that the escort's sensitive hydrophones would detect instantly. So Kretschmer ordered reduced speed, silent running, the submarine moving through the water like a ghost, trying not to disturb the air. This meant accepting longer transit times, slower response to evasion maneuvers, less control. It meant accepting that the ship above him would keep attacking because he could not move fast enough to escape. The contradiction was absolute. Speed risked discovery through sound. Silence risked entrapment. There was no third option, no clever tactic that resolved this mathematics. The hours became a succession of attacks rather than a continuous assault. Depth charges would fall, explode, and the water would ring with their detonation. Silence would follow for a period measured in minutes, 5, 10, 15, depending on how effectively Kretschmer's maneuvers had disrupted the escort's bearings. Then the sound would come again, sometimes from a different direction, sometimes preceded by the characteristic sound of a ship changing course. The escort vessels were hunting in coordination, Kretschmer understood. One would establish contact while the other maneuvered for approach. They were using him like hunters use dogs, flushing prey toward an invisible net. The crew in the forward torpedo room, secured in near-total darkness to preserve battery power, experienced each explosion as a blow to the compartment itself. Paint cracked, a support bracket twisted. Water began seeping through a poorly sealed hatch fitting, a trickle that was managed but not stopped, a constant reminder of the ocean's pressure waiting beyond the hull. Men working in the engine room felt the heat from the diesel that could not run, a ghost of power sitting silent and useless. The radio compartment was sealed and silent. Radio transmission would announce their position instantly. The galley was closed. The crew existed in designated spaces, maintaining absolute silence, their breathing deliberately slowed, their movements deliberate and minimal. Kretschmer's mind worked through scenarios with the exhaustion of a man who understands that his survival depends on perfect calculation at the moment when calculation becomes nearly impossible. He had trained for underwater evasion, had studied anti-submarine tactics in captured British manuals, had discussed the theory of coordinated escort patterns with other U-boat commanders. But theory and reality were separated by the noise of each successive depth charge, by the gradual accumulation of damage, by the knowledge that every hour underwater cost him battery reserves that could not be replenished. The escorts above held the advantage of endurance. Their ships had engines that would run for days. His submarine had batteries that would run empty in a known number of hours. They did not need to sink him. They only needed to keep him submerged until the batteries died, until he was forced to surface into guns already trained on where he would emerge. This was siege warfare in the vertical dimension. Pressure applied not by force, but by the mathematics of endurance. Kretschmer relayed orders in the measured tones of a commander who showed no uncertainty, but the calculations were grim. His options were narrowing with each passing hour. The psychological weight of extended underwater combat under attack cannot be easily translated into words for those who have not experienced it. The crew of U-99 faced not the single trauma of an explosion, but the repetition of small traumas, accumulating across hours. The mind adapts to threat through adrenaline and focus, but adrenaline depletes, and focus becomes a weariness that feels like drowning even in air. Younger sailors, those on their first patrols, began to show the strain. Eyes stared at nothing, hands trembled slightly, even when the explosions had ceased. The experienced men maintained composure through the simple mechanism of having survived prior attacks. But even that well of confidence was not infinite. Officers moved between compartments, checking damage, assessing crew condition, relaying reports to Kretschmer in the control room. The boat had taken damage. Nothing catastrophic yet, but damage that accumulated. A battery cell was malfunctioning, reducing available power. The port diesel fuel line had a hairline fracture that risked contaminating the fuel supply if the boat remained submerged much longer. The propeller gearing made a new sound, subtle but present, a grinding that might mask itself in the ambient noise, or might be precisely the sound the escort's hydrophones were tracking. The night stretched on with an elasticity that seemed to violate the normal passage of time. Kretschmer consulted with his chief engineer repeatedly, each conversation returning to the same facts. Battery depletion was approaching critical levels. The damage was manageable in the short term, but not sustainable over many more hours. The escort vessels above continued their patterns, their attacks spacing further apart, as if they were becoming confident in their strategy, as if they understood the mathematics as clearly as Kretschmer did. The water around the submarine remained active with the sound of hunting. Propeller noise, the subtle acoustics of hull vibration, directional changes announced through shifting frequencies. The escorts were not frantic, they were methodical. This suggested experienced crews, possibly commanded officers, surely men who had done this before. The realization that he faced not just superior force, but superior experience, added another layer of weight to Kretschmer's assessment. He was being hunted by men who understood U-boat tactics because they had studied them, trained against them, anticipated them. The advantage he had held for so long, the unpredictability born from innovation and daring, had evaporated the moment he found himself trapped beneath escorts who simply would not make the mistakes that previous hunters had made. Around midnight, perhaps 6 or 7 hours into the submerged combat, the escorts initiated a concentrated attack pattern that suggested a decision had been made at the command level. Multiple depth charges fell in rapid succession, spaced closely enough that the shock waves seemed to merge rather than separate. The control room shuddered violently. A pipe in the overhead fractured partially, releasing a spray of salt water that hissed downward like a viper. The forward battery compartment's ventilation was compromised. Chlorine gas began forming as salt water mixed with battery acid, a dangerous chemical reaction that demanded immediate action. Kretschmer ordered the compartment sealed and vented through alternative routes, a process that took precious minutes and risked further damaging the battery capacity. The crew, working in near darkness with only emergency lighting, moved through procedures they had drilled but never genuinely expected to execute. The smell of the chlorine, acrid, burning, permeated the boat even after the immediate danger was isolated. It remained in the air as a chemical threat, a reminder that the submarine was being destroyed in slow motion, piece by piece, system by system. By 2 in the morning, roughly 8 hours into the submerged ordeal, the question had shifted from whether U-99 could escape to whether it could remain submerged long enough for the crew to have any chance of survival at all. The battery reserve was dropping toward what the chief engineer called the final margin, the power level below which surfacing became the only option, as running the diesel engine required the batteries themselves to function initially. Kretschmer faced the calculation that defined this moment. He could attempt to surface and fight, emerging into guns, already tracking his probable location, hoping that speed and the chaos of surface action might allow escape toward open water. Statistically, this meant near certain death for most of the crew. He could remain submerged until the batteries died completely, hoping that by then the escorts might lose track of him. But this meant eventual forced surfacing from a dead submarine, essentially helpless, or, the final option, deliberate scuttling with the hope that the crew could escape through hatches into British rescue. These were not choices anyone wanted to make. They were the mathematics of survival against impossible odds. The depth charges continued through the night, but with longer intervals now, as if the escorts above were settling into a patient siege rather than pressing for an immediate kill. The silence between attacks might have been worse than the attacks themselves. During the explosions, action was demanded, reactions were clear, consciousness was focused on immediate survival. During the silence, there was only the sound of the submarine itself, the slow creep of water into damaged compartments, the hum of battery discharge, the irregular breathing of exhausted men trying to remain still. Kretschmer moved through the boat during these silent intervals, assessing damage personally, speaking quietly to crew members, his presence a form of reassurance, even as his expressions betrayed the severity of the situation. He understood something that the younger sailors were only beginning to grasp. The submarine had already been defeated. The only remaining question was whether the defeat would be total or whether something could be salvaged from the destruction. His mind was already calculating not survival, but the terms of inevitable surrender. The moment when preserving the crew's lives became the paramount concern above all other considerations. As the first grey hints of approaching dawn crept into the narrative of the night, though no crew member beneath the ocean could see it, Kretschmer sat in the control room with all available information before him. The batteries were nearly exhausted. The damage was beyond repair, with the boat submerged. The escorts remained in position above, their sonar and hydrophone operators still actively searching, still ready for any movement that might reveal the submarine's location. The crew was exhausted, the air was growing foul, and the weight of 8 hours of continuous attack had transformed fear into something deeper and more difficult to manage. The knowledge that all available options led to abandonment of the vessel. Kretschmer understood that every moment he chose to remain submerged, hoping for an escape that would not come, was a moment he was gambling with his crew's lives, against odds that had already been decided by the mathematics of endurance and the coordination of the hunt. The escort vessels above were not going to leave. They were not going to give up. They had settled in for the duration, confident that time itself was now their weapon. The darkness that had seemed to offer some form of protection now felt suffocating, absolute, a tomb, slowly filling with water and consumed air. The psychological toll of hours submerged under repeated attack was visible on every face in the submarine. The drawn expressions, the haunted eyes, the small tremors of exhaustion mixed with terror. Kretschmer had built his reputation on mastering fear, on converting the hunter's natural advantages into mathematical certainty, on never allowing opponents the luxury of controlling the rhythm of engagement. Now all of that, the skill, the experience, the reputation, had encountered a force that could not be outmaneuvered because it was not fighting with tactics, but with sheer, patient, coordinated endurance. The escorts above had transformed the Atlantic into a cage, and the bars of that cage were made not from steel or fire, but from the simple fact that one side had unlimited power and the other side's batteries were approaching zero. Otto Kretschmer, the tonnage king, the silent one, the man who had sunk more tonnage than any other submariner alive, was about to face the one enemy he could not defeat, time running out. The depth charges came without mercy and without end. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the pressure hull of U-99, with a force that seemed to compress time itself, turning seconds into hours, and hours into an existence measured only in the intervals between detonations. Kretschmer stood in the control room, his hand gripping the periscope standard, feeling the submarine shudder around him like a living creature in agony. Above, in the darkness of the Atlantic, HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter had settled into a pattern of systematic destruction, dropping their deadly cargo at calculated intervals, herding the U-boat deeper, forcing it into a progressively smaller cage of survivable depth. The captain's jaw remained set, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge and the growing list of damage reports being relayed from every compartment. Around him, 52 men existed in a coffin of steel and water, their fates bound to his decisions and to the mathematics of buoyancy and pressure. The first critical hit had torn open the stern tubes and flooded the after compartments with seawater that cascaded through the boat like a breaking dam. The engineers had fought to seal the breaches, moving through darkness lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in a sickly red glow, navigating by touch and memory through passages they had traversed 1,000 times, but now seemed like passages of the dead. The starboard diesel engine had seized within minutes of the initial depth charge pattern, its cooling system compromised beyond repair, leaving only the port engine functional, and forcing Kretschmer to operate at minimal electrical power to conserve the batteries that were the submarine's only means of propulsion when submerged. The gyroscopic compass wobbled erratically as shock waves disrupted its delicate instruments, and the hydrophone operator reported that the British vessels had adopted a search pattern that allowed no safe vector of escape, no gap in their acoustic net. Each explosion rattled the deck plates beneath their feet, loosened rivets that wept seawater in thin, persistent streams, and sent loose objects crashing through the compartments in the darkness, a constant reminder that the barrier between survival and drowning measured only centimeters. Kretschmer calculated with the precision that had made him legendary, the same mental discipline that had allowed him to stalk convoys and place torpedoes with devastating accuracy, now turned inward toward the grim mathematics of submarine entrapment. The battery was his clock was his death warrant, and every ampere drawn from the cells represented minutes stolen from the hours remaining before power failed completely. At their current depth of 130 meters, they could remain submerged for perhaps another 4 hours, if they rationed power to absolute minimums, running only the essential systems, maintaining only the most basic propulsion to keep the boat's bow pointed toward deeper water and away from the British hunters. But the British had time and numbers on their side, and they needed only patience. Depth charges continued to fall, the pattern drawing tighter, the intervals between explosions growing shorter, suggesting the escorts were gaining confidence in their targeting and closing the distance with each coordinated run. The captain's face showed no emotion, but those who served under him understood that he was conducting a silent conversation with the physics of submarine warfare, and the conversation was not going well. The crew worked in absolute silence, a discipline born from training and from the terrible understanding that sound travels through water like a knife through flesh. Men moved through the boat like ghosts, replacing damaged components with shaking hands, securing loose equipment, repositioning weight to counteract the list that threatened to drag them beyond the submarine's maximum safe depth. The air grew foul with each hour of submersion, thickening with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, fear, and the chemical staleness of recycled atmosphere. The junior officers worked the trim tanks with obsessive precision, adjusting ballast by mere kilograms to maintain neutral buoyancy, a process that demanded constant calculation and carried the knowledge that a single miscalculation of a few tons could send them either plummeting into the depths or rising uncontrollably toward the guns waiting at the surface. The sound-powered telephone system crackled with whispered damage reports, each message carrying its own catalogue of disasters: flooding in the aft compartments, pressure damage to the hull plating, failures in the steering mechanism that forced them to navigate using only the hydroplanes. One man sat at the hydrophone, his headset clamped to his head, eyes closed, listening to the sounds of the destroyers moving above them, trying to interpret the acoustic signatures and predict where the next depth charges would fall. The temperature in the boat had dropped steadily as they dived deeper, and remained submerged, the cold of the Atlantic seeping through the hull, turning breath into mist, making movement difficult for men already exhausted by hours of combat and fear. Officers distributed blankets and encouraged men to move about to maintain circulation, knowing that hypothermia killed as surely as the sea itself. In the forward torpedo compartment, men lay among the loaded tubes, coiled in whatever space they could find, conserving energy, trying not to think about the reality of their situation or the alternative uses those tubes had served hours earlier when Kretschmer had launched his final attack. The galley had been shut down hours ago to conserve power, and men existed on the memory of food and the occasional cup of water, their stomachs empty, their mouths dry, despite the overwhelming presence of water that surrounded them. The radio man made no attempts to transmit. Radio transmission would give away their position instantly, leaving them isolated from the rest of the German Navy, fighting alone in a darkness that had become both literal and existential. Another depth-charge detonation rattled the entire length of the submarine, closer than the others, and this time, something catastrophic happened. The lights went out momentarily, plunging the control room into absolute blackness, and emergency lighting flickered back to life with agonizing slowness. Kretschmer heard the sound before he felt it, a high-pitched hiss of compressed air escaping into the hull, a sound that every submarine officer had heard in nightmares. The crew found the source within minutes, a twisted valve body in the after compartment, blown open by the concussive force of the explosion, and seawater began to enter at a rate that exceeded the capacity of the emergency pumps. Men were detached from their stations and sent aft to counteract the flood, crawling through the increasingly narrow passages of a dying boat, their hands numb with cold and fear. The water rose steadily, and the crew that remained at their stations understood with sudden clarity that they were no longer fighting to win, but fighting to survive, and that survival was becoming less certain with each passing minute. Kretschmer stood motionless as the damage reports continued to flow in, each one a sentence in a narrative he could read with terrible clarity. The port engine had overheated from the loss of cooling water and could no longer be relied upon, leaving the submarine dependent entirely on battery power for propulsion. The trim systems were failing in sequence, forcing the boat into a gradually increasing angle of descent that had to be corrected by hand, a process that was physically exhausting and emotionally devastating to men who understood they were fighting against the laws of physics themselves. The compass spun uselessly, requiring the navigators to attempt dead reckoning based on the last reliable fix they had obtained hours earlier, a method of navigation that offered no comfort and no certainty. The structural integrity of the pressure hull was compromised in at least 3 locations: narrow gaps, where rivets had blown, and where the strain of repeated depth-charge impacts had begun to separate the steel plates themselves. At their current depth, the pressure exerted by the surrounding ocean exceeded 130 kilograms per square centimeter, and the integrity of the vessel that stood between the crew and an agonizing death was deteriorating with each passing minute. The British had settled into a rhythm of attack that suggested methodical confidence, dropping charges at regular intervals that allowed no possibility of escaping the designated kill zone. HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter had established a coordinated pattern, one vessel approaching from a direction, while the other maintained hydrophone contact, creating a net of acoustic and surface detection that left no room for evasion. Every minute that U-99 remained submerged was a minute that the battery grew weaker, the air grew fouler, and the structural damage accumulated. Kretschmer understood, with the clarity of a man confronting absolute reality, that the British could simply wait. They could maintain their search pattern, drop charges at intervals, and allow time and the ocean itself to accomplish what their weapons might not. The U-boat was not in a position to attack, could not rise to surface without being met with overwhelming gunfire, and could not sink faster than the water pressure would crush it to oblivion. The tactical situation had transformed from hunter and hunted into a situation where the hunted animal faced a choice between being killed by the hunters or escaping into the jaws of an even more terrible death. The crew's discipline remained intact, but Kretschmer could sense the psychological shift occurring in the compartments around him, a change in the emotional atmosphere of the boat that no depth gauge could measure. Men had moved beyond fear into a kind of fatalistic acceptance, a strange calm that came from surrendering the illusion of control and accepting the reality of their circumstances. The submarine had been transformed from a weapon into a trap, and every man aboard understood the distinction with terrible clarity. Officers checked their watches obsessively, calculating remaining battery power, estimating remaining time, running the mental mathematics that all submarine officers understood, but none dared speak aloud. The young sailors maintained their stations with mechanical precision, performing tasks they had performed countless times before, their training and discipline holding them to their posts, even as their minds grappled with the possibility of dying in this metal coffin, crushed by water and pressure, or drowning in darkness as the boat filled with water, or burning as the air grew toxic and consciousness faded into the ultimate darkness. Kretschmer had faced difficult moments before, decisions made under pressure, calculations conducted under fire, but never had he faced a situation where his own skill and determination seemed to offer no path forward. The boat had been damaged by forces beyond his control. The enemy had advantages that could not be overcome by tactics or cunning, and the ocean itself had become as much an enemy as the British destroyers above. He stood in the control room and conducted a final assessment, the kind of calculation that separated exceptional commanders from ordinary ones, the kind of decision that would echo across decades in the memory of those who lived through it. The mathematics was stark. The battery would fail within 3 to 4 hours, perhaps less if the boat descended further and the pressure increased. The structural damage could not be repaired at depth, only managed. The crew could not remain conscious and functional in this atmosphere for more than 8 hours, possibly less given the psychological strain and the physical exhaustion that had accumulated through the night. Each minute of submersion was a minute lost, each explosion a step closer to the final moment when choice became moot and fate became absolute. The captain's hand on the periscope standard was steady, but his mind had begun the process of confronting a reality that few commanders ever faced. The understanding that continued resistance in the current situation offered only the guarantee of death for 52 men, that surrender offered the possibility of survival, and that the choice between these two options was fundamentally his to make. Around him, the crew continued their work, securing equipment, managing the boat, performing their duties with the discipline and professionalism that had been drilled into them since their first day in the submarine service. They did not yet understand that their captain was beginning to consider whether honor and orders and the demands of the Third Reich were concepts that held any meaning when measured against the lives of the men whose names he knew, whose families he could visualize, whose trust in his command had never wavered even in this extremity. The Atlantic pressed down upon them from above. The destroyers circled above them like wolves, and the mathematics of survival grew steadily more complex and more merciless with each passing moment. The night was not yet over, but for Otto Kretschmer, the nature of the battle had fundamentally changed. Deep within the Atlantic Ocean, in the cold darkness of a submarine reduced to a metal prison, a man faced a choice that would define not his victory, but his humanity. Otto Kretschmer stood in the control room of U-99, surrounded by the groaning metal walls that had once been his instrument of dominance. The depth charges had stopped coming for now, but the silence was perhaps more terrible than the explosions. The batteries were nearly exhausted, the hull was compromised in multiple places, and the air had grown thick and foul with the breath of more than 50 men packed into spaces designed for far fewer. Every surface of the submarine dripped with condensation that fell like tears onto the steel deck plates. The men around him were exhausted, their faces marked by the particular expression of those who have been waiting for death in absolute darkness. They had endured hours of this, hours that felt like days, and Kretschmer knew, with the certainty of a professional, that their time had expired. The mathematics of submarine survival were brutally simple, and Kretschmer had always been a man who understood mathematics. They had proven themselves methodical and relentless, coordinating their attacks with a precision that suggested training and determination rather than luck. HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter had demonstrated a hunting competence that surpassed anything Kretschmer had encountered in his previous patrols. The escorts did not tire as men tired. They could maintain their search patterns indefinitely. They had radar that could see in darkness. They had sonar that could hear the faint whisper of a U-boat's propellers through thousands of meters of ocean. And now, they had Kretschmer's exact location, his approximate depth, and nothing to lose by continuing to press their advantage. He understood, as few German submarine commanders did, that luck in warfare was temporary, and that skill alone could only extend the inevitable for so long. But the mathematics extended beyond his own survival into something far more complex and far more important. Every man aboard U-99 had a family, wives, parents, children, waiting in German ports and German towns for their return. Some of these men had already survived one sinking in this war. Others had been selected specifically because they possessed the training and temperament to serve under Kretschmer's command. They were not conscripts forced into submarines by circumstance alone, but skilled volunteers who had understood the risks and accepted them. To preserve their lives had been part of Kretschmer's unwritten contract with his crew from the moment he assumed command. He had never spoken of it directly, but every decision he made in patrol had reflected this understanding. He had turned back from some profitable hunting grounds when weather or escort strength suggested that pressing on would mean accepting losses that went beyond tactical necessity. He had fought aggressively when the tactical situation favored the U-boat, but he had never fought to the point of futility. There were other U-boat commanders in the German fleet, men of considerable skill and bravery, who seemed to view their crews almost as expendable resources to be exhausted in pursuit of tonnage records and ideology. Kretschmer had never accepted this equation. The orders from Berlin were explicit and unambiguous. U-boat commanders were instructed to fight their vessels until they sank, or until they could not remain afloat. Surrender was not mentioned as an option, because in the worldview of the Third Reich, surrender by a warship commander was essentially unthinkable, a betrayal of the state, the service, and the principles for which the war was being fought. To surrender was to admit defeat, and the regime did not easily accommodate admissions of defeat. Yet Kretschmer had learned through his long career that orders written in comfortable offices in Berlin often bore little relationship to the physical realities facing men 800 meters below the surface of a hostile ocean. An order to fight to the last torpedo, to the last battery charge, to the last breath of air, meant nothing to the men who would do the dying. It meant something only to the abstraction that issued such orders. And Kretschmer had never been a man who allowed abstractions to supersede his judgment of concrete circumstances. There was, in fact, something almost liberating about the moment when he recognized that he could no longer save his boat. The Atlantic campaign was lost, not symbolically, not politically, but materially and strategically. By early 1942, the trend had become unmistakable to anyone who studied the facts honestly. The Allies were building more escort vessels than the U-boats could sink. They were implementing convoy systems that grew more sophisticated each month. They were producing merchant shipping faster than submarine tonnage could destroy it. And crucially, they were training their crews to a standard of excellence that was beginning to match or exceed the quality of the best U-boat commanders. Kretschmer had seen the writing in these cold waters long before he saw it in official reports. Every patrol had become more difficult than the one before. The opportunities that had seemed almost unlimited in 1940 and 1941 had become rare and precious. By late 1941 and early 1942, fighting U-99's specific battle to the bitter end would not change this larger reality. It would only add to the count of dead sailors, German and British alike. Kretschmer turned to his first officer and the crew members who stood nearest to him in that steel tomb. He did not make a speech, which would have been out of character. Instead, he spoke with the quiet directness that had always characterized his command style. The boat was finished, he said. The hull could not be repaired. The batteries were depleted. The crew had done their duty, and done it with discipline and courage. There was no shame in surrender when the tactical situation had become hopeless, when continued resistance would mean the certain death of men for no strategic gain. They would surface, and they would abandon ship, and they would conduct themselves with the dignity befitting members of the German Navy. The men around him understood immediately what he was saying. There was no relief visible on their faces. Fear and uncertainty are not so easily dismissed, but there was a kind of resignation that came with the knowledge that the waiting was finished, that one way or another, the ordeal would end within the next few minutes. Preparing a submarine for surface and abandonment required a specific sequence of operations that had been drilled into every German submarine crew. Main vents had to be opened so that water would flood the ballast tanks. The submarine would become heavier and less buoyant, and would cease to be a submarine in any practical sense. This was not a reversible process. The moment Kretschmer gave the order to blow the main vents, he was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. He was transforming U-99 from a vessel of war into a sinking ship, and he was taking the calculated risk that the British would not open fire on the crew as they abandoned the vessel. It was not a certainty. There were precedents, both ways. Some Allied vessels had respected the surrender of German U-boat crews. Others had not. Kretschmer was betting the lives of more than 50 men on the hope that the British officers commanding HMS Walker and HMS Sharpshooter were the sort of men who would honor the convention of mercy towards surrendering sailors. It was a faith-based decision, and faith in war is always dangerous. The crew moved to their stations with a kind of mechanical precision. They had rehearsed this evolution during training, though they had done so in the abstract, assuming it would never actually be necessary. Now it was necessary. Some of the younger men, those on their first patrols, moved with visible tension. The older sailors, those who had survived previous sinkings or near sinkings, moved with a kind of weary acceptance. Kretschmer watched them with his characteristic calm. His face did not betray any internal conflict, any doubt about the decision he had made. Whether he felt doubt internally, whether any rational man could face the unknown without doubt, remained his private knowledge. What he presented to the crew was the steadiness they needed in that moment. If their captain could face this with calm, then perhaps they could endure it as well. This was the function that officer training was meant to provide. In extreme circumstances, the ability of a commander to project confidence and control could mean the difference between panic and discipline, between men acting intelligently and men acting in hysteria. The orders were given. The main vents opened with a sound like water sighing through metal. The submarine began to lose buoyancy. The nose tilted down slightly as the weight of water increasing in the ballast tanks pulled the vessel into a descending angle. Kretschmer had been through this sensation hundreds of times during deep dives, but this time the sensation carried a finality that made it almost surreal. This was not the controlled descent of a combat maneuver. This was the beginning of the death throes of a ship. The gauge readings told the story that the crew could feel in their bodies. The submarine was rising, but it was also flooding. The pressure was equalizing. Within minutes, U-99 would break the surface of the Atlantic, and the men aboard would have perhaps moments to evacuate before the vessel sank completely. As the submarine rose toward the surface, the British destroyers above would be detecting the change. They would feel the sudden movement of the target they had been hunting for so long. They would see the conning tower emerge from the water. They would face their own split-second decision about how to respond. Would they open fire, treating the submarine as an enemy until it was fully neutralized? Or would they recognize the surrender and hold their fire? Kretschmer could not know. He could only have made the decision that seemed most likely to save his men's lives, and he had made it. The rest would be determined by chance, and the character of the British officers who commanded those destroyers. The submarine broke the surface, and sunlight flooded through the open hatch. For men who had been in absolute darkness for hours, the light was almost painful. Kretschmer climbed the ladder to the conning tower with deliberate slowness. He was going to be among the first to appear on the surface, visible to the British gunners. This was not coincidence. A commander who ordered his men to surrender while remaining protected himself would have lost their respect forever. He would face whatever the British chose to do first, and only then would the crew follow him into the Atlantic. This was the final exercise of his command, not to save himself, but to demonstrate to his men that their captain would share their fate. The water was cold beyond belief, the kind of cold that stops the breath and makes thought difficult. The crew was emerging now, moving toward the rubber boats and life rafts. Some men were injured from the depth charging, others were simply exhausted. All of them were surrendering to an unknown fate, following the example of their captain. Kretschmer floated in the water, with the same calm expression he had worn in the conning tower. Around him, the men of U-99 swam toward the British vessels. The destroyers had held their fire. The surrender was being accepted. The final patrol of the greatest U-boat commander in the German Navy was over. Not with glory, but with the harder choice. The choice of a man who valued the lives under his command more than his own legend. In the cold darkness of the Atlantic, time had become both infinite and compressed. Hours of depth charging had left U-99 a vessel barely holding together, her crew operating at the edge of human endurance in a steel tomb filling with seawater and the smell of fear. The batteries that powered the boat were dying. The air was thick and foul. Every compartment was damaged, and every man aboard understood that the mathematics of survival no longer favored them. Kretschmer moved through the boat in the pre-dawn hours, assessing with the clarity that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. He had commanded this vessel and these men with brilliance and precision across dozens of patrols, sinking more tonnage than any other submarine captain in the German Navy. Now, the skill that had made him legendary, reading the sea, understanding his enemy, calculating odds, told him a simple and terrible truth. The escorts above would not relent. They had coordinated their attacks with methodical efficiency, and they possessed both the numbers and the technology to wait him out. U-99 did not have the fuel or the oxygen to disappear into the Atlantic. She did not have the structural integrity to dive deeper. She had only one path remaining, and Kretschmer chose it with the same calm that had always defined him. The order went quietly through the compartments. Prepare the boat for surfacing. There was no drama in the command, no speeches about honor or sacrifice. These were practical instructions, delivered in a whisper, because sound could carry through the water to the hunters above, and every moment of silence might matter. The crew moved with the strange mixture of relief and dread that accompanies the end of an ordeal. The worst of the uncertainty was over. No more sitting in darkness waiting for the next explosion. No more listening to the groaning of metal under pressure and wondering if this moment would be the one when the hull finally split. Instead, there was the immediate clarity of what came next. The boat would surface, they would abandon her, and they would surrender to the men hunting them. For most of the crew, this meant capture. For some, it meant something else. Death in the freezing water, disease in the coming years of imprisonment, the peculiar suffering of men separated from home and hope. But it was better than the certainty of drowning in the darkness, trapped in a submarine that had become both their shelter and their coffin. Kretschmer understood this calculation. He had always understood calculations. The only difference was that this one involved not tonnage or tactical advantage, but human lives, the lives of men who had served under him with discipline and trust. In the hours before dawn, on the 17th of March, 1942, the British escort vessels maintained their vigilance above. HMS Walker, under the command of Captain Frederick John Walker, was one of the most skilled anti-submarine tacticians in the Royal Navy. He had coordinated the attacks with HMS Sharpshooter with the precision of a man who had done this work before and understood the weaknesses of both submarines and the men who commanded them. Walker knew that his prey was damaged. He knew that the U-boat's options were narrowing. He had heard nothing from the hydrophones for some time now, which suggested either that the submarine had foundered or that her commander was attempting the dangerous game of silent running at minimal depth. The destroyers moved slowly across the area, prepared for another attack run, but also prepared for the possibility that the submarine might attempt to surface. Walker had given orders that if U-99 broke the surface, she would be engaged with gunfire immediately. There would be no negotiation, no warning beyond the bullets themselves. This was the reality of naval warfare in 1942, where mercy was the exception and the routine was cold and efficient. The U-boat's tanks vented water. The process was gradual and controlled, a carefully executed sequence that prevented the boat from bobbing to the surface too quickly or presenting an uncontrolled target. Kretschmer stood in the control room, hands steady, voice steady, watching the depth gauge as it climbed from the crushing darkness toward the world above. Around him, men were moving to their stations for the surfacing, following procedures drilled into them 100 times. Others were gathering what few possessions they might be able to carry if they had to abandon quickly. Letters from home, photographs, small items of personal meaning that represented lives lived before the war, when the future had seemed infinite. The boat rose through the layers of the Atlantic, each meter bringing them closer to air and light, and whatever fate waited in the form of the British naval guns. There was no certainty that they would survive the next few minutes. A direct hit on the conning tower as they surfaced could mean the end of the war for them, a quick and definitive conclusion to years of struggle and violence. Kretschmer did not dwell on this. He never had. He thought instead about the sequence of what came next, the actions that would give his crew the best chance at survival. The U-boat broke the surface into a grey dawn, and immediately the world changed. Light flooded the conning tower. The wind hit them with the shock of extreme cold, and above all, there came the sound of British gun crews tracking the submarine and preparing to fire. Kretschmer emerged onto the conning tower as the boat settled into the waves, and his first action was to order the crew to abandon ship. The order came as a voice through the speaking tubes, calm and distinct, reaching men in compartments who understood exactly what it meant. Hatches opened. Sailors began emerging from below, moving toward the foredeck and the conning tower, preparing to jump into the water or onto the hull, abandoning the vessel that had carried them through the Atlantic and now would carry them no further. The British guns tracked the movement, their crews waiting for the order to fire. It came, and the first round struck water near the U-boat, sending up white plumes that seemed almost theatrical in the pale morning light. Kretschmer watched this unfold with the detachment of a man observing something that was already beyond his control, something that had been decided long before this moment, perhaps long before this war began. The crew came onto the foredeck and the conning tower platform in growing numbers, jumping into the water or clinging to the boat's hull, trying to stay clear of the guns that had begun their systematic work. The ocean was brutally cold, water that would kill a man in minutes if he remained in it long enough. Many of the sailors were not strong swimmers. Many had spent their entire service aboard the U-boat, never expecting to find themselves in the Atlantic rather than protected within it. But the choice was binary, the water or the guns. They chose the water. Kretschmer remained visible on the conning tower, a target that should have made him a priority for the British gunners. But there was something in his bearing, something in the way he stood above the chaos of abandonment, that seemed to command a different response. The guns did not cease firing at the U-boat itself, but there were no shots fired directly at the conning tower, no rounds that seemed aimed specifically at the man standing above the boat. Whether this was accident or deliberate restraint remains uncertain, lost now to history and the perspective of men long dead. What is certain is that Kretschmer remained visible as his crew abandoned his command, accepting without argument or resistance the end of his Atlantic dominion. Below the waterline, the submarine was already dying. Men in the lower compartments worked methodically to open the seacocks, to ensure that U-99 would not remain as a prize for the British to capture and study. This was standard practice, a duty that fell to certain crew members as others fled. The boat was taking on water by design now, not through rupture or desperation, but through deliberate intention. But Kretschmer had ensured that the classified materials were secured or destroyed. The ship's papers that might